There are bad childhoods. Then there's Vlad the Impaler's childhood. The kind of upbringing that makes your worst family reunion look like a Disney musical. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Welcome to 15th century Wallachia, a place that could best be described as medieval Game of Thrones, but with fewer dragons and way more actual blood. This was a land squashed between the expanding Ottoman Empire, hungry for more territory, and the ambitious Hungarian kingdom to the north. If you were born into Wallachian royalty, congratulations. Your birthright included political enemies, assassination attempts, and the constant threat of being stabbed at dinner. In Wallachia, politics wasn't so much about backstabbing as it was about front-stabbing. At least then you could see it coming. In the middle of this wonderfully murderous playground, in 1431, a boy named Vlad was born in the fortress town of Saigioara in Transylvania. His father was Vlad III Dracula, Dracula meaning the dragon, because dear old dad had been inducted into the Order of the Dragon, a European knightly order sworn to defend Christendom against the Ottomans. Sounds noble, right? Well, being in the Order of the Dragon didn't stop Vlad III from playing both sides whenever it suited him. This was a man who changed allegiances faster than you can change your shirt. The good news for Vlad III, our Vlad, he had royal blood. The bad news? That blood was practically an open invitation for everyone to try spilling it. By the time little Vlad was just a boy, his father was already entangled in a deadly political balancing act. Wallachia had to pay tribute to the Ottoman Empire to avoid invasion, kind of like paying protection money to a gang, except the gang had an army of 100,000 and an actual empire. As part of this arrangement, Sultan Murad II demanded something more personal than gold hostages. So in 1442, Vlad II handed over two of his sons, Vlad, around age 11, and his younger brother Radu, probably about 7 or 8, to the Ottomans, as political insurance, which is basically medieval for, here, take my kids so you don't kill me. And so began what we might call Vlad's trauma tour. You know your childhood's rough when your version of a school bully is literally the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, while other boys might have been worrying about learning to ride a horse or shoot an arrow. Vlad was busy trying not to annoy a sultan who could order him executed before breakfast. And don't think this was some cushy royal exchange program. Sure, they learned Turkish, studied strategy and gained insight into their captors, but they also experienced the Ottomans' version of discipline. Think whips, chains and constant reminders that misbehavior equals death. And no, Vlad didn't even get a gold star for good effort. It's also worth mentioning, his brother Radu had a very different experience. Radu was the charming, adaptable one. The Ottomans liked him. He made friends. He fit in. Vlad, not so much. He was brooding, bitter, and stubborn. The kind of kid who probably stared down his captors and mentally measured their throats for a future blade. Historians suggest this is where the seeds of Vlad's hatred for the Ottomans were planted. Day after day of humiliation, forced obedience, and watching his brother get praise while he simmered with rage. That'll do it. Vlad was not the forgive and forget type. He was more of a plot for years and get creative with revenge type. Meanwhile, back home, things weren't exactly peaceful either. While Vlad and Radu were hostages, their father Vlad II Dracula was trying, and mostly failing to keep his throne amid Wallachian civil wars and boyar betrayals. The boyars, the Wallachian nobility, were as trustworthy as a snake oil salesman with a shifty grin. They'd smile at you at court, then stab you in the back or front in the night. Vlad II eventually lost everything, including his life. His eldest son Mishia was captured by rival nobles, and in true Wallachian fashion was reportedly tortured and blinded before being buried alive. Family game nights must have been intense in this clan. For young Vlad, word of his father's and brother's gruesome ends surely filtered through the walls of his Ottoman prison. Imagine sitting there as a political pawn, knowing your homeland was being carved up by the very people who murdered your family. If there's ever a recipe for turning a boy into a hardened, vengeful man, this was it. Combine betrayal, captivity, loss, and humiliation. And you've got the perfect ingredients for one of history's most terrifying rulers. All those later forests of the impaled. You could argue they started right here, in the cold, bitter heart of a boy who learned too young that mercy was for the weak. By the time Vlad finally left Ottoman captivity years later, he wasn't just a prince, he was a man forged in rage, betrayal, and the art of survival. The Ottomans had taught him much, but the biggest lesson he learned was never let your enemies feel safe. Imagine becoming king, but your royal crown comes with a note. Please return within 7 days or death may apply. Picture this. It's 1448. Wallachia is in chaos. Again, because that's just how Wallachia liked to roll. The political scene is a brutal tug-of-war between local noble families, ambitious neighbours like Hungary, and the ever-looming Ottoman Empire. The throne of Wallachia wasn't so much a seat of power, as it was a trapdoor that could open at any moment, usually when you least expected it, and into this snake pit stepped Vlad, fresh from captivity with the Ottomans, where he'd honed his taste for vengeance. He saw an opportunity, a brief golden window, when Wallachia's throne was empty, and its factions were busy tearing each other to pieces. It was the medieval version of musical chairs, except instead of music stopping, it was swords clashing, and instead of chairs, it was heads rolling. The man who had been ruling Wallachia, Vladislav II, had marched off with the Ottoman army to fight against John Hunyadi of Hungary at the Second Battle of Kosovo. Vlad saw his chance. While Vladislav II was away losing battles, he could swoop in and grab the crown. And that's exactly what he did, probably with a small force, backed by the Ottomans, who saw him as their pawn in waiting. And so, in late 1448, Vlad claimed the throne. He was about 17 years old, not old enough to legally rent a horse in some kingdoms, but old enough to rule a land where your neighbours might try to murder you before breakfast. For a few shining weeks, Vlad III, son of the dragon, was Prince of Wallachia. It should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, it was more like a job offer where the first requirement on the list reads, "Must be okay with frequent assassination attempts." And oh, they came. Wallachia was not one of those cozy kingdoms where everyone toasted the new ruler with wine and goodwill. No, it was more like, "Welcome, Prince. Now let's see how fast we can betray you." The boyars, Wallachia's nobles, weren't thrilled to see him. They had long memories, and they remembered Vlad's father playing both sides. They didn't trust Vlad any more than they trusted each other, which was to say, not at all. Meanwhile, Vladislav II heard about this little palace coup. He didn't like it, so he did what any self-respecting deposed prince would do. He hurried back with an army. In just about 2 months, give or take a few sleepless nights, filled with plotting, paranoia, and maybe some early attempts at impalement practice, Vlad was forced to flee. His reign ended before most people could even memorize his new titles. Vlad's first stint as prince lasted about as long as a medieval feast before someone got poisoned. Blink and you'd miss it. But here's where things get interesting. Even in this short, doomed first rule, Vlad showed signs of the ruthless ruler he would one day become famous for. He didn't step onto the throne as a wide-eyed boy hoping for peace and harmony. No, he came in swinging. His methods were blunt, brutal, and efficient. Any rivals who didn't fall in line were swiftly dealt with, sometimes literally cut down, sometimes forced into exile, and sometimes just disappeared in ways that left no doubt about the message. Vlad doesn't forgive, and he definitely doesn't forget. The young prince's reign may have been brief, but it set the tone for what was to come. He learned the hard way that in Wallachia, mercy was weakness, and weakness got you a nice plot in the royal graveyard, usually sooner rather than later. Vlad took notes. If his first time on the throne was a test, he passed it with one key insight. Next time he wouldn't just grab the crown, he'd make sure no one could take it from him. What's remarkable is that despite being forced out so quickly, Vlad managed to leave an impression. The nobles who had smirked at his fall would one day come to regret it, and bitterly so, because when Vlad came back, he came back with a plan. No more polite diplomacy, no more trying to balance noble factions. Next time he would rule by fear, and that throne, it wouldn't just be a seat of power, it would be a fortress, surrounded by a moat filled with the skulls of his enemies. Okay, not literally, but close enough. His brief taste of rule in 1448 taught him that Wallachia wasn't a land you could govern with charm or treaties. It was a place where survival depended on being the most terrifying person in the room, or the whole country, and Vlad, he was ready to be that person. Imagine becoming king, but instead of a coronation banquet, you get a giant target on your back. That was Vlad's first reign. Short, sharp, and full of valuable lessons, mainly that next time he wouldn't just play the game, he'd flip the board over and impale the players. Let's just say Vlad didn't invent impalement, but he sure turned it into a medieval art form. Michelangelo had his sculptures, Vlad had his stakes. If there's one thing that secured Vlad the Impaler's gruesome place in history, and in the nightmares of his enemies, it was his fondness for a little hobby called impalement. Now, impalement wasn't new. Ancient civilizations had been using it as a punishment for centuries, but while other rulers treated impalement as a tool, Vlad treated it as his masterpiece. If cruelty were a competition, Vlad wouldn't just have won gold, he'd have designed the medal and forced you to wear it on a stake. So, what exactly is impalement? Buckle up, because this isn't your average medieval punishment. At its simplest, impalement involved taking a long, sharpened wooden stake, sometimes as thick as a man's arm, and inserting it through the body. But Vlad was a perfectionist. He had a preferred method. First, the victim would be hoisted onto the stake, the sharpened end inserted through a, shall we say, strategically soft part of the anatomy, the rear, or occasionally the belly. The stake would then be carefully worked upward through the body, missing vital organs so the person didn't die too quickly. Because what was the point if your victim didn't suffer long enough for everyone to see? In some cases, the stake would exit through the mouth, shoulder, or even out an eye socket. And no, Vlad didn't just leave people slumped over. The stakes were raised vertically, leaving the poor soul dangling high above the ground like some hideous human flag of doom. Death wasn't quick. It could take hours, sometimes days. You know how we say slow cooked makes things tender and delicious? Vlad took that idea and applied it to psychological warfare. Now, why did Vlad choose this method above all others? Because he understood something that modern marketers also know: branding matters. A simple execution might get the job done, but impalement sent a message. Vlad wasn't just killing enemies, he was turning them into gruesome billboards. His forests of impaled bodies weren't random cruelty. They were deliberate, horrifying tableaus designed to make invaders and traitors think twice, 3 times, or maybe turn right around and run for the hills. Imagine approaching a town, hoping for easy conquest, only to find hundreds, maybe thousands of impaled bodies lining the roads. Some were fresh, some had been there long enough to be skeletons. The smell, unbearable. The sight, unthinkable. The message, crystal clear. This is what happens when you cross Vlad. It was psychological warfare at its finest. Terror without even having to draw a sword. And let's not forget, Vlad wasn't sloppy about his displays. There was an almost artistic precision to the arrangement of his victims. Chroniclers wrote of entire fields where the stakes were lined up in neat rows like grim human orchards. Tall stakes for high-ranking enemies, shorter ones for commoners. Some victims impaled in pairs, others placed in circles around villages like grotesque wreaths. If he could have added a plaque reading, "Welcome to Wallachia, please behave," he probably would have. What really cemented impalement as Vlad's signature move was how he refined it into a spectacle. He didn't just impale enemies after a battle, he used it for internal control too. Disloyal boyars, up they went. Foreign envoys who disrespected him, up they went. Peasants who broke his harsh laws. You guessed it, no one was immune, and that was the point. Vlad's Wallachia wasn't a land of laws and fairness. It was a place where fear was the law, and the stakes were the enforcers. Imagine your morning commute involving a pleasant stroll past several hundred rotting corpses on sticks. Suddenly, your boss's passive-aggressive emails don't seem so bad. Vlad's love of the stake was so infamous that it became his brand across Europe. In German pamphlets, the medieval version of a viral hit piece, artists depicted Vlad dining among the impaled, calmly enjoying his meal while his victims twitched around him. Were these accounts exaggerated? Probably. But did Vlad mind? Not one bit. He wanted his enemies to believe he was a monster. If people thought he drank blood and slept on a pile of skulls, that just made his job easier. And so, impalement became more than a punishment. It was Vlad's personal stamp, his signature in blood and terror. A simple execution might erase an enemy. Impalement erased hope. And that, above all, was what Vlad wanted. A kingdom so drenched in dread that even the bravest foes thought twice about stepping foot inside it. While Michelangelo chiseled marble into timeless beauty, Vlad carved his legacy into history with sharpened wood and an imagination that could give horror directors nightmares. If there was one enemy that Vlad the Impaler truly reserved his special brand of fury for, it was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans weren't just any adversary, they were a symbol of humiliation from Vlad's youth. Remember, Vlad spent part of his childhood as a hostage in their court, learning their language, studying their customs, and quietly seething with the kind of resentment that could curdle milk. When he finally got his hands on real power, you can bet the Ottomans were at the very top of his hit list, and so began one of the most brutal personal vendettas in medieval history. Vlad's campaigns against the Ottomans weren't polite border skirmishes or delicate diplomatic spats. No, these were scorched earth, take no prisoners, leave no body unimpaled affairs. Vlad didn't just want to win, he wanted to make the Ottoman sultans deeply regret ever crossing him. The most legendary episode in this grim saga was the night attack at Targovice in 1462. Now, most generals prefer to fight with the sun at their back, banners flying, maybe a stirring speech beforehand. Vlad preferred surprise, terror, and a healthy dose of confusion. Picture it, a dark summer night, the Ottoman army, tens of thousands strong, encamped near Targovice, exhausted from their march into Wallachia, probably dreaming of a swift victory. Little did they know, they were about to get a crash course in why you should never underestimate Vlad the Impaler. With a small force, Vlad launched a daring assault right into the heart of the Ottoman camp. No trumpet fanfare, no formal battle lines, just pure, unfiltered chaos. His men crept in under cover of darkness, setting fires, cutting down soldiers as they slept, and generally turning the camp into a waking nightmare. Vlad's goal, to assassinate Sultan Mehmed II himself. He missed, but only barely. Imagine the Sultan's shock, waking up to find enemy warriors slicing their way toward his tent, flames lighting the night like some hellish festival. It's said that Vlad's men killed thousands that night, leaving the Ottoman army demoralized, disoriented, and probably questioning all their life choices. It was less battlefield glory and more what happens when your worst nightmares pull up, uninvited at 3 a.m. But Vlad wasn't done. After the night raid, he unleashed a campaign of scorched earth tactics that would have made even the most ruthless commanders pause. He ordered wells poisoned, crops burned, villages emptied or destroyed. His goal was simple: starve and weaken the Ottoman invaders until they had no choice but to retreat or die trying to stay. And then came the Forest of the Dead. As Mehmed's forces advanced, they came upon one of the most chilling sights ever recorded in military history. Vlad had ordered the impalement of tens of thousands of people, Ottoman prisoners, traitors, and anyone unlucky enough to fall into his hands. Their bodies were arranged in massive rows along the roads and fields near Targovice. The stakes stretched for miles, a morbid warning that Wallachia was no ordinary conquest. Even Mehmed II, the man who conquered Constantinople, who led vast armies and crushed empires, was rattled. Chroniclers claimed he stared at the spectacle in horror, taking in the sheer scale of the carnage. Some say he muttered that it was impossible to defeat a man capable of such terrifying displays. Others say he simply turned around and decided Wallachia wasn't worth the trouble. Whatever he said, one thing's for sure: Vlad's message had been received loud and clear. Picture it. Mehmed rolls up thinking he's here for a conquest, and instead finds what looks like the world's worst Halloween decoration contest. Vlad's strategy wasn't just about physical destruction. It was a master of psychological warfare. Every impaled corpse was a silent ambassador of terror. Every burned village whispered, "Turn back while you still can." And the best part, for Vlad, he didn't need to outnumber his enemy. Fear did most of the work for him. It's important to note that Vlad wasn't reckless. Brutal, yes, but every stake, every torch, every poisoned well served a calculated purpose. He knew his lands were small and his forces limited, so he played the only card that could even the odds, make himself scarier than the Ottoman war machine. And somehow, against all expectations, it worked. Mehmed eventually withdrew, leaving Wallachia battered but unconquered, and Vlad's legend firmly cemented in the nightmares of two empires. Who needs stone walls and moats when you've got 20,000 stakes, and a reputation that makes invading generals wish they'd stayed home? Vlad's idea of a team-building dinner with the nobles, sure, right before he had them impaled, Bon appetit. If Vlad the Impaler had a list of people who ruined my childhood, the Wallachian boyars, the local nobles, would have been right at the top, written in big angry letters, underlined twice. These were the men who betrayed his father, assassinated his older brother, and left young Vlad a pawn in a deadly game of thrones. So when Vlad came to power, he wasn't interested in playing nice. He wasn't interested in playing at all. What he wanted was payback, and he served it hot, cold, and everywhere in between. From the start of his reign, Vlad saw the boyars as the root of Wallachia's instability. These weren't loyal advisors or wise elders. They were schemers, plotters, and backstabbers who treated the throne like a prize to be passed around at will. Kings came and went, but the boyars always seemed to land on their feet, fat, rich, and ready to betray the next ruler. Vlad, however, wasn't like the rulers before him. He didn't want to share power. He wanted to break theirs, and what better way to start than with a good old-fashioned feast? Except, in Vlad's case, feast didn't mean wine, song, and polite conversation. No, it meant trap. On Easter Day, when the boyars gathered in the capital, probably expecting a ceremonial meal, maybe a few toasts to unity and peace, Vlad had other plans. Picture it. The great hall buzzing with chatter, goblets raised, plates piled high. Then, the doors slam shut, the soldiers file in. The mood shifts from celebration to sheer panic. Vlad rose not to make a toast, but to declare judgment. He accused the boyars of treason, of murder, of causing endless suffering through their treachery. And then, he ordered them seized. The older nobles, too weak to work or run, were impaled on the spot, their feast turning into a macabre banquet of terror. The younger, stronger boyars were chained and marched out of the city. Nothing says, "Thanks for coming," like being force-marched up a mountain, after your friends are skewered like medieval kebabs. But Vlad wasn't done with them yet. He drove his captives to the ruins of Poenari, a fortress high in the Carpathian Mountains. There, he gave them a simple choice: rebuild the fortress stone by stone, or die. And let's be clear, this wasn't a weekend DIY project. The terrain was brutal, the conditions were deadly, and Vlad wasn't providing OSHA-approved safety standards. Many of the nobles died from exhaustion, disease, or simply collapsed where they stood. Their bones, it said, became part of the very foundations they were forced to build. Why go to all this trouble? Because Vlad knew that as long as the boyar class existed in its old form, no ruler could ever truly control Wallachia. So, he didn't just punish the individual nobles, he targeted the entire system. He stripped the boyars of their power, their lands and their wealth. Those who survived his purges found themselves reduced to shadows of their former selves, or quietly vanished altogether. Vlad's version of land reform. What's mine is mine, what's yours? Also mine. The results were dramatic. With the boyars crushed, Vlad centralized authority like never before. For the first time in memory, the prince wasn't a puppet dangled on noble strings. His rule was absolute, enforced by terror. Yes, but stable in a way Wallachia hadn't seen in decades. He filled the vacuum with men loyal to him alone. Soldiers, minor officials, and those who owed everything to his favor. There were no more private armies lurking in castle keeps, no more whispers of conspiracies at court. Just Vlad, the throne, and the sharp looming threat of the stake for anyone who thought about challenging him. Of course, to foreign observers, this made Vlad look like an unhinged despot. German pamphlets gleefully painted him as a monster, the prince who impaled dinner guests, enslaved nobles, and ruled with blood-soaked hands. But within Wallachia, the picture was more complicated. To the peasants and common folk who'd suffered under boyar greed and infighting, Vlad's brutality against the elites might have seemed like cosmic justice. After all, they weren't the ones ending up on stakes. They were, for once, watching someone else get what they deserved. You've heard of cleaning house? Vlad didn't just clean it. He burned it down, impaled the furniture, and built a fortress out of the ashes. In Wallachia, under Vlad the Impaler, crime didn't just go down, it practically evaporated. Petty thieves, highway robbers, con artists, they all seemed to vanish like smoke in the wind. And the reason was simple in Vlad's kingdom. Breaking the law wasn't a matter of paying a fine or spending a few nights in a dank dungeon. No, breaking the law meant breaking your life, or more accurately, having it broken for you, possibly with a large wooden stake. Vlad wasn't interested in second chances or heartfelt apologies. His justice system was refreshingly simple. Steal something? Impaled. Lie to an official? Impaled. Fail to work your fields like a proper peasant? You guessed it. Impaled. The man didn't believe in rehabilitation. Unless you count becoming a permanent feature of the local landscape as a kind of moral lesson for passers-by. One of the most famous legends of Vlad's reign tells of a golden cup, solid gold, no less, left sitting in the middle of a public square in Targovica. It wasn't chained down, no guards posted, just this dazzling, obviously stealable object, glinting in the sun. A medieval invitation to temptation. And yet, no one dared touch it, not for a day, not for a week, not for years. The cup reportedly sat there, unmolested, because everyone knew one greedy hand on that cup, and that hand, and probably the rest of you, would end up on a stake by sundown. It wasn't just thieves who felt Vlad's wrath. He expected every man and woman to do their duty. Lazy peasants who didn't work their land, impaled. Vagabonds wandering without purpose, impaled. Cheaters and liars. You get the idea. The result? A society where you could drop your purse in the dirt and find it right where you left it 2 weeks later. Nobody wanted to risk a meeting with Vlad's executioners, or worse, with Vlad himself, who was said to personally oversee some of the more creative punishments. Imagine a village square in Wallachia. The children play, merchants hawk their wares, and over in the corner, a dozen rotting corpses on stakes, gently swaying in the breeze, each a silent testimonial to Vlad's zero-tolerance policy. Talk about setting the mood for market day. And yet, here's the twist. For all his horrifying methods, Vlad's system worked. The roads of Wallachia, once infamous for bandits and cutthroats, became some of the safest in Europe. Merchants who wouldn't have dared travel without an armed escort could suddenly pass through with carts full of gold, knowing no one would risk robbing them. It's the kind of crime reduction any modern mayor would envy, though they'd probably stop short of impalement as a civic strategy. Of course, to outsiders, this all looked less like good governance and more like sheer madness. Travelers from Western Europe told wide-eyed tales of Vlad's punishments. German pamphlets and Saxon chroniclers painted him as a lunatic despot who delighted in cruelty for cruelty's sake. After all, who else would think of sticking people on giant spikes as public service announcements? But within his own borders, things weren't quite so black and white. For the long-suffering peasants, people who'd endured decades of noble corruption, banditry and endless invasions, Vlad's brutality brought something rare: order. They might have flinched at the bodies, but they also slept easier at night, knowing no one was likely to break into their hut and steal their last chicken. In a grim, medieval way, Vlad's Wallachia was probably safer than most of Europe. Let's not pretend, though, that this was a utopia. Vlad's version of justice left no room for mercy or mistakes. If you were falsely accused, or caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, well, congratulations. You were now part of the region's ever-growing collection of human lawn ornaments. No trial by jury, no appeal, just the stake, the hammer, and a lot of screaming. And what about those caught gossiping or complaining about Vlad himself? It said he'd impale even the slightest critic, ensuring his reputation for fairness was matched only by his reputation for silencing dissent, permanently. In Wallachia, free speech wasn't just discouraged, it was a fast track to becoming landscape art. Turns out, nothing motivates good behavior like the risk of becoming yard decor. If medieval Europe had tabloids, Vlad would have been on the cover every week. Vlad impales 10,000. You won't believe #7. In the 15th century, Vlad the Impaler ruled his corner of Europe with terror and stakes. Lots of stakes, but as frightening as he was in Wallachia, something even more powerful than his gruesome punishments was about to take over: the power of storytelling. Vlad wasn't just a ruler, he became a legend. A monster shaped as much by the quills of his enemies as by his own bloody deeds. Let's set the stage. Picture the merchants, nobles, and envoys of Saxony, Hungary, and the Holy Roman Empire. These weren't exactly Vlad's fan club. Many had watched their trading routes crumble, their allies impaled, or their own envoys humiliated at his court. And when people like that get their hands on a printing press, you can bet they won't be writing glowing Yelp reviews. The German pamphlets were the first to roll off the presses, the medieval equivalent of a viral social media campaign. These weren't thoughtful histories, They were lurid, over-the-top tales packed with horror, meant to shock, disgust, and let's be honest, sell like hotcakes. Printed in crude woodcuts and bold letters, they depicted Vlad feasting among forests of the impaled, boiling his enemies alive, and, in one particularly stomach-turning account, forcing mothers to eat their own children. Yes, someone clearly thought that would sell more copies. Medieval marketing was brutal, and here's the kicker. Most people who read these pamphlets had never been anywhere near Wallachia, but that didn't matter. The pamphlets painted Vlad as the boogeyman of the East, the embodiment of barbaric cruelty. These stories spread like wildfire across the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. Suddenly, Vlad wasn't just a prince of a small troubled region, he was the face of evil. Picture your worst enemy writing your biography, then adding a few creative touches like, and he drinks blood at dinner. That's basically what happened to Vlad. The Hungarians, too, got in on the act. Vlad's complicated relationship with Matthias Corvinus, King of Hungary, gave them every reason to blacken his name. When Vlad was eventually captured by Matthias, the Hungarian court used these horror stories as justification. Look at what this man has done. Of course we had to lock him up. We're doing Europe a favor. Never mind that many of the tales were exaggerated, twisted, or outright fabricated. They served their purpose. Vlad was discredited in the eyes of potential allies, and Matthias got to play the hero while keeping Vlad out of the political game. And then, there was the unintended consequence: immortality. These pamphlets, designed to ruin Vlad, did something far more enduring. They created the template for a myth that would last for centuries. Bram Stoker wouldn't write Dracula for another 400 years, but the seeds were planted here. The Eastern prince with a thirst for blood, the nightmarish ruler of a shadowy land, the man who ruled through terror. All of these elements were whispered across Europe, long before Stoker ever put pen to paper. Why did these stories spread so easily? Partly because they tapped into deep fears. To the Western Europeans, the Balkans and lands beyond were already seen as wild, strange, and dangerous. Add in a ruler who used impalement like modern rulers use paperwork, and you had the perfect villain. But it wasn't just fear. These stories also served political goals. They justified military campaigns, trade embargoes, and diplomatic snubs. And let's not forget the sheer human love of gossip. Medieval folk weren't so different from us today. Give them a tale of blood, gore, and scandal, and they'll pass it on at lightning speed. It's like medieval clickbait. This prince's favorite hobby will shock you. Doctors hate him. There's also something almost hilarious about how creative these early propagandists got. One German woodcut shows Vlad calmly dining at a table set among the impaled, because apparently nothing enhances your appetite like the smell of rotting corpses. Another shows him skinning people alive. You start to wonder whether these pamphlet authors were reporting news or auditioning for the world's first horror novel competition. And yet, despite their distortions, these stories helped define how Vlad would be remembered. They turned a complex, brutal ruler who fought invaders, imposed order, and centralized power into a monster of legend. The real Vlad was many things: a prince, a warlord, a nationalist, a master of psychological warfare. But thanks to the propaganda war, he'd be remembered first and foremost as the bloodthirsty impaler. So the next time you see Dracula's fangs on a Halloween mask, remember the vampire's true ancestor wasn't some undead creature of the night. It was a living man, caught in the world's first media smear campaign, and impaled on the stakes of his enemies' words, as surely as his victims were on wood. After years of impaling everyone else, Vlad finally got a taste of being on the pointy end of politics. Vlad the Impaler might have been a master of terror, but in the end, it wasn't sharpened stakes that brought him down. It was something far more dangerous: politics. If Wallachia had been a chessboard, Vlad would have been that player who started flipping pieces and setting the board on fire. But eventually, the other players got tired of his style, and they teamed up to take him out. Let's rewind a little. By the 1460s, Vlad had made enemies everywhere. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II wanted his head. The Wallachian boyars who'd survived his earlier purges dreamed of revenge. And neighboring powers like Hungary watched him the way a cat watches a particularly annoying mouse, waiting for the right moment to pounce. For a while, Vlad tried to balance his alliances like a medieval tightrope walker. He made promises to Hungary's King Matthias Corvinus, playing the Christian defender against the Muslim Ottomans. He offered deals to other regional leaders. He tried to keep the nobility terrified enough to stay loyal, but not so terrified that they all defected at once. But here's the problem. When your diplomacy consists mainly of threats, terror, and the occasional mass impalement, your allies don't exactly feel warm and fuzzy about you. The final straw came in 1462, after his infamous night attack at Targovice and his gruesome Forest of the Dead. Vlad found himself with fewer friends than ever. The Ottomans regrouped, furious and determined to remove him. His own people, exhausted by years of war, famine and fear, began to waver. And in Hungary, Matthias Corvinus, once Vlad's supposed ally, saw an opportunity. After all, Vlad was becoming a liability. Better to lock him up and play the part of Europe's responsible Christian king than to keep supporting the guy whose diplomatic style involved body counts. And so, with the political winds shifting, Vlad was betrayed. Captured under murky circumstances, some say during peace negotiations, others say while seeking aid, Vlad found himself in Hungarian custody. Suddenly, the man who had spent years controlling others through fear was at the mercy of kings and jailers. The Impaler had become the imprisoned. Vlad spent his life turning enemies into garden stakes. Now he was a guest in someone else's garden, and the view wasn't great. Vlad's captivity lasted about 12 years, give or take. He wasn't thrown into a rat-filled dungeon, despite what later legends claimed. But make no mistake, he was out of power, out of favor, and out of options. His enemies painted him as a madman. Remember those German pamphlets from earlier? Matthias Corvinus waved them around as proof that he had to lock Vlad up. After all, what Christian king could let such a monster roam free? Of course, Vlad wasn't entirely forgotten during these years. The political map of the region continued to shift. The Ottomans expanded, and their shadow grew longer over Central Europe. And as fear of the Sultan's armies spread, some began to wonder, maybe having Vlad on their side wasn't such a terrible idea after all. Sure, he was terrifying, but he was their terrifying prince, and no one could deny his skill at defending Wallachia's borders, even if his methods gave everyone nightmares. And so Vlad waited, watched, and plotted. Captivity wasn't in his nature. While locked away, he likely dreamed of stakes, enemies, and his return to power. He kept in touch with allies where he could. He watched as Wallachia fell into chaos under weaker rulers, and when the moment came, when Hungary needed a strong man to stand against the Ottoman tide, Vlad's name came back into favor. His past horrors were, for the moment, forgiven in the name of political necessity. Nothing says we missed you like dusting off the keys to your cell because the neighbors are invading again. But those years in captivity had taken their toll. Vlad was older, perhaps more bitter, and certainly more isolated than ever. The world he stepped back into wasn't quite the one he'd left. His enemies had multiplied, his reputation had grown even darker, and the political games had only gotten deadlier. And yet, against the odds, Vlad clawed his way back toward the throne, because if there was one thing he knew how to do, it was make a comeback, preferably with sharp objects involved. In the end, Vlad's fall and captivity weren't just about betrayal, they were about the dangerous game he played, a game where terror bought him short-term power, but long-term enemies. The man who ruled with fear discovered that fear can only protect you for so long before it turns on you. If there's one thing history loves, it's irony. And Vlad the Impaler's final chapter was soaked in it. After years of separating other people from their heads, Vlad ended up losing his own, and not just metaphorically. It was the kind of ending that would have made a medieval storyteller chuckle darkly into their ale before scaring a tavern full of listeners half to death. Let's rewind. When Vlad finally clawed his way out of captivity in Hungary, you might think he'd earned a peaceful retirement, maybe a nice castle, a comfortable chair, and a hobby that didn't involve pointy sticks. But no, Vlad had unfinished business. The Ottomans were pushing deeper into Europe. Wallachia was in chaos under rival claimants, and Vlad saw one last chance to reclaim his throne and his legacy. This was the early 1470s, and the political landscape was as treacherous as ever. Vlad had supporters, notably Stephen the Great of Moldavia, but also plenty of people just waiting to stick a dagger or 20 in his back. Still, Vlad being Vlad, he wasn't going to die in bed. He returned to Wallachia, took up arms, and launched himself into one final campaign. His goal: drive out the Ottomans, crush his rivals, and remind everyone why he'd been so feared in the first place. For a brief, bloody moment, it seemed like the old terror was back. Vlad fought fiercely, leading his men into battle with the same ruthless energy that had made him famous. There were no more forests of the impaled. He probably ran out of time, but he tried to reassert his brutal grip, and then, just as quickly, it all fell apart. Vlad's final act, attempting one last comeback tour, but this time the reviews were, well, let's just say he got panned. The details of Vlad's death are as murky as a foggy night in the Carpathians. What we do know is that, in late 1476 or early 1477, during a battle against the Ottomans, or possibly local rivals, Vlad met his end. Some accounts suggest he was betrayed by his own men at a critical moment. Proof that terror might win battles, but it doesn't inspire loyalty when it matters most. Others say he fell heroically in the chaos of combat, sword in hand, still trying to carve out victory. Either way, when the dust settled, Vlad was dead, and his head was very much not attached to the rest of him. And here's where it gets particularly grisly and deeply poetic, in a macabre sort of way. Vlad's head, once the source of so much dread, was chopped off and sent as a trophy to Sultan Mehmed II in Constantinople. Imagine the scene, a servant proudly presenting the head of the man who'd haunted Ottoman nightmares for decades. Mehmed, it's said, had it displayed on a spike for all to see, a grim reminder that no matter how terrifying a man might be, the Sultan still had the last word. The Ottomans finally got their hands on Vlad's head. They probably would have preferred to get it while it was still issuing death threats. But hey, better late than never. What's fascinating is how quickly Vlad's legend grew even bigger after his death. With his physical body gone, well, decapitated, his reputation as a bloodthirsty tyrant only took on new life. The very people who had feared him now whispered about his fate. Was he betrayed by his boyars? Was it the Ottomans who got him? Could his spirit still be lurking in the forests of Wallachia, waiting for another chance to impale the unwary? Adding to the mystery is that no one knows exactly where Vlad's body ended up. Some say he was buried at the Snagov monastery. Others argue his remains were lost entirely to history, perhaps dumped without ceremony after his head was shipped off. The truth is, for a man so obsessed with dramatic displays of death, Vlad's own end was strangely undignified. No grand tomb, no lasting monument, unless you count all those lurid pamphlets, just a head on a stick in Constantinople, and a name that would live on in infamy. And so, the reign of terror ended not with a mighty final impalement or an indestructible fortress holding out against invaders, but with betrayal, a swift blade, and a macabre delivery to his greatest enemy. For all his cunning, cruelty, and battlefield prowess, Vlad couldn't escape the fate that his own victims had met so many times before. In the end, Vlad proved one thing: live by the stake, die by the sword, and lose your head in the process. Vlad's legacy today, part hero, part villain, and 100% the guy you wouldn't want hosting your next garden party. Centuries after his gruesome death, Vlad the Impaler still haunts Europe. Not literally, we hope, but through his tangled legacy. Like a medieval Rorschach test, people see what they want in Vlad: a national hero, a sadistic villain, or that slightly awkward family member who takes Halloween way too seriously. His story didn't end with his decapitation. If anything, that's where the legend truly began. Let's start with Romania. Inside his homeland, Vlad is far from just a bloodthirsty despot. Here, he's often celebrated as a patriotic defender, a prince who stood up to the Ottoman Empire when few dared. Forget the forests of the impaled. What matters to many Romanians is that he protected their land from invaders, brought a chaotic nobility to heel, and fought to keep Wallachia independent, at a time when neighbours fell like dominoes. There are statues of Vlad in Romania. Schools, streets, and businesses bear his name. To them, he's not a monster. He's the guy who did what had to be done. Sure, his methods were extreme, but medieval rulers weren't exactly handing out hugs and participation trophies. Of course, cross the border into, say, Hungary or Turkey, and the view shifts dramatically. There, Vlad is remembered as the butcher, the impaler, the nightmare on horseback. His name evokes horror, not pride. The pamphlets and chronicles that spread during and after his life painted him as the embodiment of cruelty, a man who made even hardened soldiers shudder at the thought of encountering him. And let's be honest, the whole forest of corpses thing didn't help his PR. And then there's Dracula. Ah yes, the vampire connection. The thing that ensured Vlad's name would live forever, even if most people can't tell you a single fact about his actual reign. Centuries after his death, Bram Stoker stumbled upon the name Dracula, a nod to Vlad's father, Vlad Dracula, meaning Vlad the Dragon, and thought, perfect, I'll make him a blood-sucking immortal with a taste for Victorian maidens. Here's the funny part. The Dracula of fiction has almost nothing to do with Vlad himself. The real Vlad wasn't drinking blood in a Transylvanian castle or turning into a bat to stalk the night. Stoker borrowed the name, sprinkled in some vague tales of cruelty, and stitched together a brand new monster. The vampire legend grew, warped, and spread, until Vlad the historical figure and Dracula the fictional vampire were hopelessly tangled together. Like garlic in a vampire hunter's toolkit, Vlad never drank blood. He was too busy spilling it by the gallon. And so, the paradox of Vlad the Impaler lives on. Here was a man who did, undeniably, bring order, but at a price that would make most rulers blanch. He stabilized Wallachia, but through terror. He kept enemies at bay, but at the cost of countless lives. He was a Christian prince who fought the Ottomans tooth and nail, but whose methods sometimes made his allies question whether he was worse than the invaders he resisted. Even today, historians argue over his legacy. Was he a product of his brutal times? A man shaped by betrayal and endless war? Or was he something darker? A ruler who chose cruelty when he could have chosen another path? The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in between. Vlad was the Prince Wallachia needed in some ways, but not the one anyone could love. A hero to some, a horror to others, and forever the subject of debate at history conferences. Vlad's resume today would read, skilled in defense, nation-building, and impalement. References available upon request, but they're probably dead. In the end, Vlad the Impaler's greatest weapon wasn't his stake or his sword, it was his legend. A legacy that outlived him by centuries, morphed into myth, and ensured he'd never be forgotten. Whether you see him as savior, tyrant, or the original Dracula, one thing's for sure, he'd have loved knowing we're still talking about him. Let's talk about the Notre Dame Cathedral. Centuries of ambition, artistry, disasters, and absurdities, all wrapped up in stone and stained glass. In the 12th century, Paris was already making a name for itself. Sure, it didn't yet have croissants or the Eiffel Tower, and the fashion scene was mostly burlap and whatever you could steal off your neighbor's clothesline, but it did have ambition. The city was growing in wealth, power, and importance, and as any self-respecting medieval metropolis knew, you couldn't truly call yourself a major player unless you had a cathedral. So big, it made visitors squint in confusion and terror. Enter Bishop Maurice de Sully, a man with a vision, and not just any vision. Maurice didn't want a modest church with a few pews and a decent altar. Oh no, he wanted a cathedral, a colossal, awe-inspiring, buttress-filled wonder that would dominate the skyline of Paris and send a very clear message. This city means business. Let's set the stage. The year is 1160. Paris is the capital of the Capetian dynasty, home to the King of France, and a bustling trade hub. It's got merchants, scholars, thieves, and more tax collectors than anyone asked for. But when it came to sacred architecture, Paris felt a bit underwhelming. Sure, there was an old cathedral, Saint-Étienne, but it was small, outdated, and frankly, a little embarrassing, especially when compared to what other French cities were showing off. Take Rouen, for example. Their cathedral was the medieval equivalent of a luxury sports car parked right outside your thatched roof cottage. Chartres was already on its way to Gothic glory. Even places like Sens had cathedrals that made Paris look like it was slacking off. The bishops and city leaders of Paris were frankly tired of having their architectural ego bruised every time another bishop visited, and subtly, or not so subtly, bragged about their new flying buttresses. Maurice de Sully wasn't going to stand for that. He dreamed of a cathedral that would not only elevate the city's spiritual reputation, but also its political and cultural status. Think of Notre Dame as the medieval version of Paris applying for UNESCO World Heritage status, centuries ahead of schedule. But beyond civic pride, there was also a very practical, very medieval reason for building big to impress heaven. In those days, size mattered, at least when it came to churches. The taller, grander, and more complex your cathedral, the more likely it was, supposedly, that God would notice and grant blessings. After all, what better way to prove your devotion than by bankrupting yourself on a building project that would last so long your great-great-great-grandchildren would still be paying off the loans? And then there was competition. The bishops of Paris didn't just want to please God, they wanted to one-up their rivals. Religion in the Middle Ages wasn't just about saving souls, it was also about turf wars. If Rouen could build something grand, Paris had to build something grander. If Chartres dazzled pilgrims with its stained glass, Paris needed to dazzle them so hard they forgot Chartres even existed. Notre Dame was to be the mic drop of cathedrals, a structure so glorious that no other city would dare try to top it. But here's the catch. Grand dreams require grand budgets. The medieval equivalent of a GoFundMe was launched, except instead of pledging online, you handed over land, money, or labor. Everyone from kings to humble peasants was expected to contribute, and contribute they did. Mostly because saying no to the bishop wasn't a great career move. There were taxes, donations, and the ever-popular guilt-based fundraising. Surely you want to ensure your soul's eternal happiness by donating to this worthy cause. No pressure, but hellfire is real. Maurice de Sully's plan was so ambitious that it couldn't possibly be finished in his lifetime, and he knew it. This was not a man thinking small. He wanted a structure that would take generations to complete, a legacy project that would make his name live on. And let's be clear, it worked. You don't see anyone naming streets after the bishop who approved minor roof repairs, but build Notre Dame. Now we're talking. Beyond religious and political motives, there was also a civic element to the plan. Notre Dame wasn't just a place of worship, it was designed to be the heart of the city, a meeting place, a landmark, a symbol that no matter what happened, invasions, plagues, or tax hikes, Paris would endure. The cathedral would stand tall, reminding everyone that this was a city of faith, power, and unshakable stone. And so, with a mix of piety, ambition, and the kind of competitive spirit that made medieval bishops the original overachievers, the dream of Notre Dame was born. Paris would finally have its giant stone statement, a structure so magnificent that even the angels would have to stop and admire it as they flew by. Picture this. It's the 1160s. You're a master mason, and you've just been told you're going to help build a cathedral that will dominate Paris for centuries to come. Sounds exciting, right? Then you find out where it's going to be built, on a little patch of land in the middle of a river. Welcome to the Aile de la Cité. Prime real estate. If you're a duck, slightly less ideal if you're planning to plop down thousands of tons of stone. Building Notre Dame wasn't as simple as staking out a nice dry plot and getting to work. The Aile de la Cité was prone to flooding. The Sani, charming as it might look on a sunny day, had a habit of rising up and turning solid ground into a soggy nightmare. The first technical challenge for the builders, convincing the ground to behave long enough to hold up the heaviest structure anyone had ever tried to build in the neighborhood. And remember, this was an era when the most advanced tool for soil testing was poking it with a stick and saying, should be fine. So what did they do? They got clever. The first step was creating a foundation that wouldn't sink into the mud the moment someone sneezed too hard. The builders dug deep trenches. We're talking down to solid bedrock, where possible. Where that wasn't an option, they pounded in wooden piles and filled the trenches with layers of stone and mortar to create a stable platform. It was back-breaking work. No steam-powered drills, no hydraulic pumps, just muscle, determination, and a lot of very tired laborers. And here's the kicker. All of this was done with medieval tools. No cranes, no precision measuring equipment, just ropes, pulleys, wooden scaffolding, and math scribbled out on parchment that was probably smudged by sweaty hands. Every stone had to be cut by hand. Every trench had to be dug by hand. And if you messed up your measurements, well, let's just say you didn't want to be the guy who made the cathedral lean awkwardly toward the river. But before you could even lay a single stone, you needed the stone itself. And Notre Dame's foundation was not made of pebbles you could pick up along the Seine. The builders needed limestone, lots of it, massive blocks, each weighing as much as a small car. The quarries were located miles away, so first workers had to carve these behemoths out of the earth, using hammers, chisels, and pure stubbornness. Then came the transport. If you're imagining a medieval version of a flatbed truck, think again. These stones were hauled onto barges and floated down the Seine, a slow, careful operation that probably made everyone involved hold their breath every time the current picked up speed. Imagine spending weeks carving the perfect foundation block, only to watch it slip off a barge and disappear into the murky water. That's the stuff of medieval nightmares. Once the stones arrived at the site, they had to be unloaded and positioned precisely, again, all by hand, with the help of levers, sledges, and an unhealthy disregard for personal safety. And because this was the foundation, accuracy was everything. A wobbly base meant a wobbly cathedral, and nobody wanted to be responsible for that particular disaster. It wasn't just the visible parts of the foundation that mattered. Beneath the cathedral lies what we might call the hidden basement of Notre Dame, crypt-like chambers and support structures designed to bear the unimaginable weight of the walls and towers above. These weren't crypts for burying bodies, at least. Not intentionally, but architectural features meant to distribute pressure and keep the cathedral standing tall. Some of these spaces are still accessible today, quiet, eerie reminders of the sheer human effort buried beneath Notre Dame's majestic floor. And here's the fun part. All of this work on the foundation took years. Years of digging, hauling, placing, adjusting. Imagine signing up for a job, knowing that by the time the foundation is done, you'll probably be old enough to retire, or at least too arthritic to lift a hammer anymore. But that's what it took to create a base sturdy enough to last through centuries of storms, wars, and clumsy tourists. Nothing says job security like a foundation project that takes so long your grandchildren will be too old to lift a chisel. And through it all, the builders pressed on, working through cold winters and hot summers, often ankle-deep in mud, cursing the river that threatened their progress at every turn. It was messy, slow, and exhausting, but it worked. The foundation they built became the unshakable heart of Notre Dame, the bedrock upon which one of the world's most famous cathedrals would rise. If you've ever stood in awe of Notre Dame and thought, wow, what a masterpiece, just remember this. That masterpiece didn't build itself. Behind every soaring arch, every delicate rose window, and every smug-looking gargoyle was a workforce of human beings. Men who sweated, bled, cursed, and probably questioned all their life choices at least once, while dangling from a rickety bit of scaffolding. Let's meet the crew. First up, the stonemasons, the real rock stars of the operation, pun very much intended. These were the highly skilled artisans who carved, shaped, and positioned each block of limestone. And this wasn't just stacking rocks. Gothic architecture is basically stone Jenga at an epic scale. Every piece had to fit perfectly to support the next, especially with the fancy new flying buttresses that everyone was raving about. A mason's work required precision, patience, and nerves of steel. Drop one badly cut stone into the wrong spot, and you weren't just risking your reputation, you might bring half the cathedral down. Then there were the carpenters. While Notre Dame might be famous for its stone, the skeleton of the building, especially the massive roof structure, was wood. Carpenters crafted the enormous wooden frames that supported arches during construction, built scaffolding, and assembled what was called the forest, the nickname for the huge oak beams that held up the original roof. Every beam was hand-cut, shaped with axes and saws, and hauled into place without so much as a pulley that wouldn't give you a hernia. Working alongside these were the stained glass artists. These people weren't just making windows, they were telling stories. Each pane of glass was a medieval comic strip. Colourful depictions of saints, sinners, and scenes designed to teach the illiterate masses about scripture and morality. And let's not forget, this wasn't modern glass you could order by the pallet. Each piece was blown, coloured with mineral pigments, and cut by hand. The artists had to fit these fragile jigsaw puzzles into stone frameworks high up on scaffolding, all while the wind threatened to turn their masterpiece into an expensive pile of shards. And then we had the apprentices. The medieval interns. These were the young lads, and very, very occasionally girls in secret, who fetched tools, mixed mortar, and learned the trade by doing the jobs nobody else wanted. The apprentices hoped that, if they survived long enough without losing a finger or an eye, They might one day rise to the rank of master mason, carpenter, or glassmaker. It was a long road paved with blisters and bruises. Now, let's talk about those working conditions. Imagine standing on a narrow wooden beam, 100 feet above the ground, holding a chisel in one hand and trying not to look down. There were no safety harnesses. Helmets? Not a thing. Protective gloves? If you wanted protection, you wrapped your hands in scraps of cloth and hoped for the best. Injuries were common, from crushed fingers to broken bones, and worse. And remember, this wasn't just risky because of heights. A single slip with a chisel or hammer could mean permanent damage, and there was no workers' comp in the 12th century. You got hurt, you went home if you could, and that was the end of the paycheck. Weather added insult to injury. Builders worked through scorching summers where the sun baked the stone until it was hot enough to fry a medieval omelette, and through bone-chilling winters where frostbite was a real possibility. There were no snow days. Rain, mud, ice. Get back on that scaffolding. The cathedral wasn't going to build itself, and heaven forbid the bishop catch you slacking off. But despite these brutal conditions, the cathedral rose, thanks in part to the structure of guilds. These were medieval trade unions, but without the dental plans. Guilds controlled who could work on the cathedral, and ensured that only trained craftsmen touched the important parts. You couldn't just walk onto the site and declare yourself a mason. You had to be accepted into a guild, trained for years, and pass strict tests. The guilds guarded their secrets fiercely: how to cut stone so it wouldn't crack under pressure, how to mix the perfect mortar, how to fit glass into lead frames that wouldn't collapse at the first gust of wind. These weren't just jobs, they were lifetimes of knowledge passed down from master to apprentice. And perhaps most impressive of all, this was work done without caffeine. No coffee, no energy drinks, no vending machines with questionable sandwiches, just bread, ale, and sheer determination. The good news? You're learning a trade. The bad news? That trade involves dangling off a wall 100 feet up without a safety harness. So the next time you gaze up at Notre Dame's towers or admire its intricate carvings, spare a thought for the countless workers who made it happen. The masons who shaped the stone, the carpenters who built the bones, the glassmakers who colored the light, and the apprentices who hauled, fetched, and hoped to live long enough to be in charge one day. Notre Dame wasn't just a monument to faith or art. It was, and still is, a monument to human effort, and to the medieval workers who risked everything for it. Picture yourself standing in medieval Paris, craning your neck to admire Notre Dame, and what do you see? A majestic cathedral. Yes. Stunning stonework. Yes. And then, that, perched along the edges of the roofline. Monsters. Dozens of them. Grotesque creatures with wings, claws, fangs, bulging eyes, and the kind of facial expressions you'd expect from someone who just stepped on a Lego barefoot. Welcome to the bizarre, wonderful world of Notre Dame's gargoyles. The original rain gutters that moonlighted as supernatural bouncers. First, let's get something straight. Gargoyles weren't just there to look spooky, though they did that very well. They had a job, and that job, keeping rainwater from destroying the building. See, in an era before plastic drain pipes, builders had to get creative. The solution? Carve long-necked stone creatures that could act as spouts. When it rained, and it rained often in Paris, water would gush out of the gargoyles' mouths, away from the delicate stone walls and foundations below. This helped prevent erosion, cracks, and structural damage. In short, gargoyles were Notre Dame's first line of defense against water damage. Medieval plumbing at its most terrifyingly artistic, because nothing keeps demons away like a stone lizard puking rainwater onto the street below. But gargoyles weren't the only weirdos on the cathedral. Enter the grotesques. Statues that looked just as monstrous but didn't have the handy rain-spouting feature. If a gargoyle is a functional drain pipe, a grotesque is its lazy cousin who's just there to hang out and look menacing. These figures perched all over the cathedral's exterior, on towers, walls, and balustrades, serving no purpose other than to delight, horrify, and confuse onlookers. So why fill a holy building with creatures that looked like the cast of a medieval horror movie? For starters, it was about symbolism. People in the Middle Ages had a complicated relationship with evil. They believed the world was full of invisible threats, demons, devils, and all manner of nasties lurking just out of sight. By putting hideous creatures on the cathedral, they weren't inviting evil in, they were keeping it out. The idea was that the sight of these terrifying beasts would scare away the real evil spirits. It's kind of like putting a fake security camera above your front door. The hope is that would-be intruders see it and run the other way. And don't forget, these figures were teaching tools too. Medieval Paris wasn't exactly packed with people who could read. The cathedral's sculptures, including the gargoyles and grotesques, acted as a kind of visual sermon. They reminded the faithful of the dangers of sin, the reality of hell, and the protection offered by the church. If you saw a monster leering down at you from Notre Dame's roof, you might think twice about skipping Mass that week. Let's also give some credit to the stonemasons and sculptors who made these creatures. While the rest of the cathedral's decoration followed strict religious themes, the gargoyles and grotesques offered artists a chance to let loose. Imagine spending your days carving solemn saints, somber angels, and holy martyrs, and then getting a commission to create a winged pig, or a monkey playing a lute, or a creature so strange that modern scholars still can't agree on what it's supposed to be. It was an outlet for medieval imagination, where fantasy and architecture collided in spectacularly weird ways. And oh, the variety! Notre Dame's menagerie includes classic dragon-like beasts, hybrid animals, and human-animal mixes that look like they escaped from someone's fever dream. Some have horns, some have beaks, some look suspiciously like your grumpy neighbor. There are creatures with bat wings, creatures with dog heads, and creatures that seem to have been inspired by whatever the sculptor saw during a particularly bad hangover. No two are exactly alike, and that was the point. Each gargoyle and grotesque was unique, a signature of the artisan who carved it. Of course, not everyone loved the gargoyles. Some later critics thought they were inappropriate for a church. What were monsters doing on a house of God? But to the medieval mind, they made perfect sense. The cathedral wasn't just a place of beauty and worship, it was a fortress of faith, a bulwark against evil, and the gargoyles were part of its defenses, spiritual scarecrows if you will. Over the centuries, many of Notre Dame's original gargoyles crumbled or were removed during renovations. In the 19th century, when architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc led the great restoration of the cathedral, he added new gargoyles and grotesques in the Gothic spirit, including the famous Chimera Gallery, home to that famous horned demon resting his chin in his hands, looking down on Paris like he's contemplating whether to conquer the city or order another croissant. So next time you admire Notre Dame's gargoyles, remember they're more than decoration. They're rain gutters with attitude, guardians of the cathedral, and a testament to the medieval talent for mixing the practical with the downright bizarre. In the end, they've been doing their job for centuries, keeping the water, and according to legend, the demons at bay, one stony rain spout at a time. Walk into Notre Dame on a sunny day, and you'll see it. Sunlight cascading through vast walls of stained glass, turning the interior into a shimmering kaleidoscope of red, blue, gold, and green. The light glows, dances, and shifts as the sun moves. It's as if the cathedral itself is breathing color. And this wasn't just some medieval mood lighting. These windows were designed to inspire awe, convey divine messages, and maybe, just maybe, distract people from how cold and drafty the building actually was. Let's start with the superstars of Notre Dame's windows. The rose windows. These enormous circular masterpieces are among the most iconic elements of Gothic architecture. The largest, the West Rose, measures over 32 feet in diameter. That's wider than most Parisian apartments. And they weren't just big, they were intricate. Imagine a giant stone wheel, filled with hundreds of pieces of individually crafted glass, each one fitted into a lead frame like a cosmic jigsaw puzzle. The result, a giant, multicolored flower that seemed to bloom with light. Now, why put so much effort into these luminous wonders? Well, in Gothic architecture, light wasn't just a way to brighten up the place. It was a symbol of the divine. The idea was that light streaming through stained glass was heavenly light, transformed by the church into something beautiful and meaningful. Where earlier Romanesque churches had thick walls and small windows, the Gothic cathedral was a miracle of engineering that allowed for enormous expanses of glass. Notre Dame's architects wanted to fill the space with colored light as a way of bringing worshippers closer to God. And to be fair, it worked. There's nothing quite like standing in that rainbow glow and feeling tiny beneath the gaze of centuries. But creating these windows was no easy task. There were no factories churning out sheets of glass. Every piece started as a blob of molten sand, potash and lime, melted together at blistering temperatures in a furnace. The glass blower would gather a glowing blob on the end of a long blowpipe, inflate it into a bubble, and then spin or flatten it into a disc. These discs were cut into pieces using a hot iron or a diamond, a dangerous, painstaking process that could ruin hours of work in an instant if a piece cracked in the wrong place. Color came from adding metallic oxides to the molten mix. Want red? Toss in some copper, blue, a bit of cobalt, gold, silver, manganese. All were used to create the vivid palette that would light up the cathedral. And this wasn't paint on the surface. The color was part of the glass itself, meaning it wouldn't fade with time or rainstorms or pigeons. Once the pieces were cut, artists painted on details, faces, folds of robes, tiny architectural elements, using a mixture of powdered glass and iron oxide. These details were fired onto the glass, so they'd stay put. Then came the assembly. Each bit of glass was fitted into 8-shaped lead strips, soldered together into panels, and reinforced with iron bars so they wouldn't collapse under their own weight. Finally, the panels were hoisted high into the stone frames, no small feat given their size and fragility, and secured in place. Each window was like a medieval PowerPoint, full of dramatic pictures, confusing messages, and nobody really paid attention after the first 5 minutes. And speaking of messages, yes, those windows told stories. The rose windows and other stained glass panels were filled with scenes from the Bible, the lives of saints, and the Last Judgment. There were kings and prophets, angels and devils, animals and symbols galore. For a mostly illiterate population, the windows were teaching tools, vivid, visual sermons in glass. Of course, just like a modern presentation, most people probably zoned out after a while, dazzled by the colors, but maybe a bit fuzzy on whether that figure in the corner was Moses or just a guy with a beard. Notre Dame's stained glass didn't just serve the faithful, it also proclaimed the power of those who funded it. Many windows bore the coats of arms of royal patrons, wealthy donors and guilds. In a way, the windows were medieval sponsored content. Paris's elites showing off their piety and their pocketbooks, all in one shimmering display. Over time, the windows faced their share of threats, war, revolution and clumsy repairs. The rose windows in particular have had a rocky history. They've been dismantled and rebuilt more than once, during the French Revolution, for instance, when many church treasures were destroyed, but remarkably, much of the original glass survived, a testament to the skill of those anonymous medieval craftsmen who shaped molten sand into something immortal. Today, Notre Dame's windows continue to awe visitors. They connect us to a world where glass wasn't just a material, it was magic. Where sunlight wasn't just illumination, it was a glimpse of the divine. So next time you see those windows glowing with the colors of a long-gone world, remember, they're the original light show, a medieval Instagram filter applied to the sky itself. If you've ever owned an old house, you know the feeling. Every time you fix one thing, another creaks, leaks or crumbles. Now imagine that house is massive, made entirely of stone, covered in delicate carvings, and considered one of the most important buildings in the country. Congratulations, you now own Notre Dame de Paris, a structure that might as well have come with a medieval version of the warning. Maintenance costs may exceed the GDP of a small nation. Notre Dame wasn't just a one-and-done project. Sure, the original construction spanned the better part of 2 centuries, because when you're building a giant stone cathedral by hand, no one's really in a rush. But even after the main structure was complete, the cathedral continued to evolve, altered, repaired, embellished, and occasionally vandalized as tastes, politics, and technology changed. Owning Notre Dame was like owning a vintage car, stylish, impressive, but guaranteed to drain your wallet every year. Let's start with the spire, or rather spires, plural. The original medieval builders didn't actually give Notre Dame the towering needle we associate with it today. For much of its early life, the cathedral had squat little bell towers and a simpler silhouette. It wasn't until the 13th century that it got its first spire, a wooden structure covered in lead that rose above the crossing of the nave and transept. Over the centuries, this spire suffered the indignities of weather, neglect, and probably a few too many pigeons using it as a restroom. By the 18th century, it was in such bad shape that they tore it down altogether. Enter the 19th century and the age of restoration fever. Architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, who had a flair for the dramatic and a deep love of Gothic architecture, as well as a certain creative license, decided Notre Dame needed its pointy hat back. So he designed the spire that many of us remember, the elegant, needle-like structure of oak and lead that soared skyward, complete with a whimsical assortment of statues, including apostles and fantastical creatures. Viollet-le-Duc even included a figure of himself among the apostles, because if you're going to oversee a massive cathedral restoration, you might as well give yourself front row seats to heaven. But it wasn't just spires getting added or swapped. Over the centuries, parts of Notre Dame were repeatedly remodeled to match whatever architectural style was in fashion. During the Renaissance and into the Baroque period, Gothic wasn't exactly trendy anymore. The cathedral's interior was updated with classical elements. Think Corinthian columns, gold leaf, and other flourishes that would have made the original Gothic designers clutch their rosaries in horror. Chapels were modified, altars replaced, and delicate medieval details were sometimes stripped away or covered up in the name of modernity. And then came the Revolution. During the late 18th century, Notre Dame became a target in the campaign to strip the church of its wealth and influence. Statues were decapitated, treasures looted, and the building itself was repurposed, at one point serving as a temple of reason, because nothing says enlightened thinking like holding meetings in a vandalized cathedral. The damage from this period required extensive repairs, setting the stage for Viollet-le-Duc's grand and controversial 19th century restoration. Throughout all this, Notre Dame was in a constant state of repair and upgrade. The lead roof had to be patched or replaced more times than anyone could count. The gargoyles and grotesques wore away under centuries of rain, wind, and pollution, requiring fresh replacements. The stained glass windows, battered by the elements and political upheaval, needed restoration, or in some cases, complete recreation. The flying buttresses shifted over time, needing reinforcement with iron rods. And let's not even get started on the endless work of cleaning soot and grime off the stone, a full-time job in itself, especially as industrial pollution blackened the once bright limestone. In short, Notre Dame was, and remains, a never-ending DIY project, albeit on a colossal scale. And just like any ambitious home renovation, the work was often subject to debate. Should restorers stick strictly to the original plans, or is it acceptable to improve on the medieval design? Viollet-le-Duc's additions, like the spire and some of the more fanciful grotesques, sparked arguments that continue to this day. Was he a genius who saved the cathedral, or a meddler who imposed his own vision on history? Depends on whom you ask, and the cycle continues. Even in the 21st century, Notre Dame needs constant care. The tragic 2019 fire that destroyed Viollet-le-Duc's spire and much of the roof triggered yet another massive restoration campaign. Once again, craftsmen, engineers, and historians are wrestling with the same questions. Rebuild it as it was? Modernize? A bit of both? Whatever the answer, one thing is certain: Notre Dame will remain a work in progress for generations to come. A vintage masterpiece that, no matter how much you pour into it, always demands a little more. So, if you ever feel overwhelmed by a home repair that keeps dragging on, just remember, at least you're not trying to keep a 900-year-old cathedral standing, stylish and safe. That's the ultimate fixer-upper. If Notre Dame could talk, the 1790s would probably be the decade it'd prefer to forget. After centuries of standing tall as the spiritual and architectural pride of Paris, the cathedral suddenly found itself in the middle of history's roadiest house party, the French Revolution. And like any grand building caught between the crosshairs of idealism, chaos, and too much wine, Notre Dame endured desecration, destruction, and some truly bizarre repurposing. Congratulations, you're now a temple of reason. Your reward? Drunk revolutionaries smashing your statues and stealing your candlesticks. Let's set the scene. By the late 18th century, France was in full revolutionary mode. The people had risen against the monarchy and the church, both of which were seen as symbols of oppression, wealth hoarding, and really bad fashion choices. And Notre Dame, well, it was basically the biggest, most obvious religious symbol you could find in the middle of Paris. The cathedral's towering spires, massive bells, and ornate decoration made it a prime target for revolutionary wrath. It was like waving a red flag at a very angry, very broke crowd. One of the first things to go, the statues. The revolutionaries saw them as symbols of monarchy and superstition, especially the 28 biblical kings lining the facade. There was just one small problem. Those weren't French kings. They were the kings of Judah, straight from the Old Testament. But the revolutionaries weren't exactly pausing for a crash course in biblical history. In their eyes, fancy crown plus long beard, plus standing on the cathedral equals royal traitor. So off came the heads. One by one, the statues were decapitated, their stony faces and crowns tumbling into the rubble below. Fun fact, the heads were rediscovered buried in a Paris basement in 1977, as if they'd been hiding out, waiting for a more sensible century. Next up, the treasures. Notre Dame had accumulated centuries of precious objects, gold chalices, jeweled reliquaries, intricately carved furniture, and more. These weren't just church decorations, they were masterpieces of medieval and Renaissance craftsmanship. But during the Revolution, such items were seen as loot for the state. The cathedral's valuables were seized, melted down for coin, or sold off. Bells, too, fell victim to the revolutionary hunger for metal. Most of the massive bronze bells were removed and turned into cannons, because if you can't call the faithful to prayer, you might as well call them to battle. And if that weren't enough, Notre Dame didn't just lose its treasures, it lost its purpose. In 1793, amid peak revolution fervour, the cathedral was officially de-Christianized. Gone were the masses, the clergy, the sacred rites. In their place came the Temple of Reason, part of a radical attempt to replace traditional religion with a secular cult dedicated to Enlightenment ideals. The cathedral, once a place of solemn prayer and choral music, became the setting for ceremonies to liberty and reason, featuring makeshift altars, symbolic statues, and, let's be honest, a fair number of drunk speeches and impromptu parties. Picture Notre Dame as a giant civic hall, echoing not with hymns, but with the sound of rowdy debates and the occasional clatter of someone knocking over a wine bottle. At one point, a goddess figure representing liberty, think revolutionary cosplay, was installed inside. The interior, stripped of much of its decoration, echoed with the emptiness of its new, strange purpose. The great rose windows, the flying buttresses, the gargoyles, they watched silently as their home became a stage for human folly. Of course, the cathedral didn't come out of this unscathed. The physical damage was severe. Broken statues, defaced carvings, smashed altars. The structure itself began to suffer from neglect. With no funds allocated for upkeep, the roof started to leak, and parts of the stonework began to crumble. Birds, wind, and rain did their part to speed along the ruin. And public opinion? Well, Notre Dame became, for a while, an embarrassing reminder of the church's fall from grace and the revolution's excesses. Some wanted it torn down altogether, its stones reused for other projects. The idea of demolishing Notre Dame seemed, for a moment, a very real possibility. But, like any good symbol, Notre Dame proved hard to kill. By the time Napoleon rose to power, cooler heads, or at least slightly less hot-headed heads, realized the value of preserving such an iconic monument. Napoleon even staged his coronation there in 1804, signaling the cathedral's return to prominence. Though the building itself remained in sore need of repair, the revolution left scars on Notre Dame that would take decades to mend. But those scars are part of its story, proof that the cathedral wasn't just a passive backdrop to history, but an active participant, bearing the marks of France's most turbulent years. When you stand beneath its arches today, you're not just looking at stone and glass. You're seeing the resilience of a structure that survived revolution, ruin, and some truly terrible ideas about interior decorating. So the next time you're tempted to start a home DIY project, remember, at least your living room didn't have to survive becoming a temple of reason. By the early 19th century, Notre Dame was in a sorry state. The revolution had left it battered, stripped, and spiritually unemployed. The roof leaked. The sculptures were decapitated or worn to nubs. The once glorious interior echoed with emptiness and bird droppings. And to top it off, Parisians mostly saw it as a crumbling old relic, like that abandoned barn on the edge of town that no one bothers to tear down, because it might still be useful for storing hay. The cathedral that had once stood at the heart of medieval Paris was, by the 1830s, little more than a neglected monument that people hurried past on their way to places that weren't falling apart. It turns out the best way to save a crumbling building is to give it a tragic backstory and a deformed hero. Eat your heart out. Modern marketing. Enter Victor Hugo, literary superstar and part-time cathedral savior. In 1831, Hugo published Notre Dame de Paris, which we Anglophones know better as the Hunchback of Notre Dame. And with that, the old cathedral suddenly found itself thrust back into the spotlight, but not for its crumbling walls or leaky roof. No, it was now the setting for one of the most dramatic, tragic, and oddly romantic stories ever committed to paper. Hugo's novel didn't just tell a tale of doomed love, injustice, and societal cruelty. It painted Notre Dame as a living, breathing character, a grand, aging giant, wounded by time and human neglect. The cathedral wasn't just a backdrop for Quasimodo's sad bell-ringing existence. It was central to the story. Hugo's detailed, loving descriptions of the architecture turned stone and stained glass into poetry. He described the carvings, the towers, the rose windows, the gargoyles, all in such painstaking, affectionate detail that readers couldn't help but feel like this battered building mattered. It's no exaggeration to say that the Hunchback of Notre Dame made Parisians, and the wider world, fall in love with Notre Dame all over again. People who had barely glanced at the cathedral before began to see it with new eyes. Suddenly, that old building wasn't just a decaying pile of rocks, it was Quasimodo's home. It was the silent witness to Esmeralda's tragic fate. It was the keeper of secrets, shadows, and centuries of human drama. And here's the truly brilliant part. Hugo wasn't just writing a novel to entertain. He had an agenda. He wanted to save the cathedral. In the preface of the book, he lamented the state of Notre Dame, calling attention to the damage done by time, vandalism, and poor restoration attempts. His novel was, in many ways, a 500-page call to action disguised as fiction, and it worked. Almost overnight, interest in restoring Notre Dame surged. The French public, moved by Hugo's words and imagery, began to pressure the government to do something about their beloved, if bedraggled, cathedral. It wasn't just about preserving a building. It was about honoring a cultural treasure, a piece of history that had become, thanks to literature, part of the national soul. This public passion paved the way for the massive 19th century restoration campaign. Remember Viollet-le-Duc from Chapter 6? He and his team were hired largely because of the momentum generated by Hugo's novel. Without Quasimodo and Esmeralda tugging at people's heartstrings, it's quite possible Notre Dame would have continued its slow crumble into obscurity, or worse, demolition. Hugo's impact wasn't limited to architecture nerds or history buffs. His novel inspired artists, poets, and musicians. Paintings of Notre Dame became wildly popular. The cathedral started appearing in prints, postcards, and guidebooks. Tourists began to visit, eager to see the setting of the book that had made them weep, and maybe double-check the bell towers for a hunchback. And perhaps the most powerful thing about Hugo's literary rescue mission was that it tapped into something universal, the idea that places, like people, have stories worth preserving. Notre Dame wasn't just stone and glass, it was memory, tragedy, beauty, and resilience, all wrapped up in one iconic silhouette. So next time you marvel at the cathedral standing proud along the Seine, give a silent thanks to Victor Hugo, the novelist who proved that sometimes the pen really is mightier than the wrecking ball. He didn't just save a building, he revived a symbol of a city's heart. Picture this: Notre Dame, after centuries of wear, tear, revolution-fueled decapitations, and being generally treated like a medieval junkyard, was in dire need of help. Enter Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, a man with a passion for Gothic architecture, and apparently no fear of a bold makeover. Viollet-le-Duc wasn't content with just patching up holes and replacing missing statues. Oh no, he approached Notre Dame the way a modern fan might approach a beloved franchise, with deep respect and the irresistible urge to add a few personal touches. Imagine being hired to repaint the Mona Lisa, then deciding she'd look cooler with sunglasses and a pet dragon. That was Viollet-le-Duc's energy. Let's rewind to the early 1840s. Thanks in large part to Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the French public had fallen in love with the cathedral all over again. But love alone doesn't pay for repairs. So finally funds were allocated, and a massive restoration project was launched in 1844. Viollet-le-Duc, just 30 years old, was brought on as co-lead architect, and soon took the reins entirely. And boy did he have a vision. First on the list, the spire. You might be surprised to learn that Notre Dame's famous spire wasn't original. The medieval one had been removed in the 18th century after centuries of wind, weather, and general neglect had rendered it dangerously unstable. Viollet-le-Duc didn't just rebuild the spire, he reimagined it. His design soared higher and sleeker than before, an elegant needle of lead-covered oak that rose 96 meters into the sky. It wasn't a precise copy of the original. It was what he thought the original should have been, if the medieval builders had his superior 19th century taste. Then came the gargoyles and grotesques. The medieval Notre Dame had plenty of these stony creatures, of course, but Viollet-le-Duc felt the cathedral needed more, a lot more. And not just for function, keeping the rain off the walls. These new creatures were creative, dramatic, sometimes bizarre, including the famous chimera who now peers pensively over Paris. Many of these additions weren't based on any historical record. They were, frankly, the architectural equivalent of fan art. Viollet-le-Duc's team sculpted demons, birds, beasts, and hybrids that wouldn't have looked out of place in a Gothic fantasy novel. His restoration wasn't limited to external ornamentation. Inside, he sought to purify the cathedral's style. Centuries of additions, from Renaissance altars to Baroque furniture, were stripped away. He wanted to return Notre Dame's unified Gothic aesthetic, or at least his interpretation of one. Where documentation existed, he tried to follow it. Where it didn't, well, Viollet-le-Duc wasn't shy about filling in the blanks with his own creative flourishes. This, of course, brings us to the great debate. Was Viollet-le-Duc a savior or a stylistic meddler? On the one hand, Notre Dame owes much of its iconic modern silhouette to him. Without his work, the cathedral might have continued its decline or been lost entirely. His attention to structural integrity saved the building from collapse. His passion for Gothic forms rekindled broader interest in medieval architecture across Europe. And let's be fair, his additions, while sometimes imaginative, blended beautifully into the cathedral's overall look. Today, most visitors assume his spire and grotesques have been there since the 1200s, but critics argue Viollet-le-Duc sometimes crossed the line from restorer to reinventor. His Notre Dame wasn't just the cathedral of the past. It was a reimagined ideal, filtered through 19th century romanticism. He wasn't afraid to ask, what would a medieval builder have done if they had my materials, my knowledge, and my taste? And then go ahead and do it. To some, that's the mark of genius. To others, it's historical fiction in stone. Regardless, by the time his restoration was finished in 1864, after 20 years of work, Notre Dame was reborn. The roof no longer leaked. The walls were stabilized. The statuary was restored or replaced. The spire pierced the sky once more, and Paris had back its beloved Gothic giant, shinier, spikier, and arguably cooler than ever. It's worth noting that Viollet-le-Duc's restoration philosophy became hugely influential. His approach set the tone for how Europe thought about preserving ancient buildings, not just freezing them in time, but sometimes completing or perfecting them in ways their original builders never imagined. So the next time you look up at Notre Dame's spire, once it's rebuilt after the 2019 fire, or snap a photo of a gargoyle glaring down at you, remember you're seeing the result of one man's ambitious, controversial, and ultimately unforgettable architectural fan fiction. For more than 850 years, Notre Dame stood defiant. It weathered the chaos of the French Revolution, Napoleon's grand parades, 2 world wars, and even generations of overly enthusiastic tourists with selfie sticks. But in April 2019, the unthinkable happened. The cathedral that had survived so many human disasters finally fell victim to a 21st century construction accident. It survived revolutions, wars, and tourists. What finally took it down? A 21st century construction accident. Somewhere, a medieval mason is rolling in his grave. On April 15th, 2019, just as the workday was wrapping up, smoke began to rise from Notre Dame's roof. The cathedral was undergoing a massive restoration project, a plan to spruce up Viollet-le-Duc's 19th century spire and tackle centuries of wear. Somewhere, amid the scaffolding, a small fire started, and thanks to the perfect storm of dry ancient timbers, windy weather, and the sheer size of the structure, that small fire didn't stay small for long. The flames quickly consumed what was known as the forest, the intricate lattice of massive oak beams that formed the cathedral's medieval roof framework. These beams, many of them dating back to the 12th century, were so ancient and dry they might as well have been kindling. Within hours, the blaze had destroyed the roof and brought Viollet-le-Duc's iconic spire crashing down into the heart of the church. Parisians watched in horror as their beloved cathedral burned, its orange glow lighting up the evening sky. The world, too, held its breath. For Notre Dame wasn't just Paris's cathedral. It was, in many ways, humanity's cathedral, a symbol of resilience, faith, art, and history. And now, it was on the brink of ruin. But out of that night of devastation came stories of incredible heroism. Firefighters, risking their lives, worked tirelessly to contain the blaze and save what they could. A human chain formed inside the burning building, passing treasures hand to hand out of danger. The crown of thorns relic, the tunic of St. Louis, precious chalices, and priceless artworks. Thanks to their efforts, the twin bell towers were spared. The walls, though scarred by smoke and water, remained standing, and miraculously, the great rose windows, symbols of medieval craftsmanship and faith, survived the inferno. As the embers cooled, something equally extraordinary happened. A global outpouring of support flooded in. Within 24 hours, more than €1 billion in pledges had been made. French billionaires, international corporations, celebrities, ordinary citizens, everyone seemed to want to help restore Notre Dame. It was as if the world collectively realized how much the cathedral meant only when it teetered on the edge of loss. Then came the real challenge: how to rebuild. Should the restoration aim for absolute historical accuracy, replicating the spire and roof exactly as they were? Or was this a chance for the 21st century to leave its own mark on the ancient structure? As Viollet-le-Duc had in his time, debates raged. Some architects proposed futuristic designs, glass spires, modern materials, even rooftop gardens. Others argued fiercely for tradition. Notre Dame should rise again as close as possible to its 19th century self, honoring the craftsmanship of generations past. In the end, French President Emmanuel Macron pledged that the spire would be rebuilt exactly as it had stood before the fire, a nod to Viollet-le-Duc's vision, and that the work would be done in time for the 2024 Paris Olympics, a timeline ambitious enough to make any medieval mason laugh nervously from the afterlife. Rebuilding Notre Dame isn't just about architectural plans and fundraising totals. It's about balancing the old and the new, using modern technology to serve ancient artistry. Craftspeople today rely on laser scans, 3D models, and digital archives to guide their hands as they recreate the roof's wooden skeleton and carve replacement stones. Meanwhile, specialists are relearning age-old techniques: how to shape lead roofing by hand, how to match the color of limestone quarried centuries ago, how to make stained glass that gleams with the subtlety of medieval light. Notre Dame's resurrection is a reminder that history isn't static. The cathedral we see today, and the one future generations will visit, is the sum of centuries of disasters, decisions, and dreams. Every fire, restoration, and debate becomes part of its ongoing story, and so Notre Dame endures, scarred but unbowed. A symbol not just of what was, but of what can be rebuilt, stone by stone, beam by beam, with the same spirit that first raised its towers above the Seine so long ago. The 100 Years' War, 116 years of petty fights, big battles and bad haircuts. Picture this: it's the early 1300s, and France and England are the medieval equivalent of neighbours who keep arguing over the same strip of lawn. But instead of lawnmowers, they have armies, and instead of petty lawsuits, they have arrows, swords, and eventually, cannons. Welcome to the prelude of the 100 Years' War, a century plus of royal family feuds, so messy it would make even the most dramatic reality show blush. At the heart of this epic squabble was a problem as old as monarchy itself: inheritance. You see, the kings of England and France weren't just neighbours, they were cousins, uncles, nephews, and brothers-in-law in a family tree, so tangled it could have doubled as a bird's nest. The issue started when France's King Charles IV died in 1328 without a male heir. Big problem. Who gets to wear the shiny hat now? Enter Edward III of England. Edward wasn't just some opportunistic foreign king. He had what, on paper, seemed like a decent claim. His mom, Isabella, was Charles IV's sister. Simple, right? Ha, not so fast. The French nobles weren't too thrilled about the idea of being ruled by an English king, even one with the right bloodline. After all, letting your rival nation's king also be your king felt risky. So the French dusted off a little legal doctrine called the Salic Law. This ancient Frankish rule basically said, sorry ladies, no passing on the crown through the female line. This conveniently excluded Edward despite his royal mum, and instead they handed the throne to Philip VI, a cousin from the male side of the family, and so began the royal equivalent of, I called dibs, followed by, no fair, you changed the rules. Edward III. I'm next in line. Philip VI. Not according to the rule we just remembered existed. But wait, the plot thickens. Edward III wasn't just King of England. He was also, awkwardly, the Duke of Aquitaine, meaning he technically owed feudal loyalty to the King of France for that chunk of southwestern France. Imagine being your rival's landlord and tenant at the same time. It was like renting a guest house to your ex. Nothing good was going to come of it. Aquitaine had long been a source of tension. The region was wealthy, strategically important, and full of people who would rather not be caught in the middle of a Franco-English custody battle. Philip VI began tightening his grip on Aquitaine, and Edward started to feel the heat. If Edward had been looking for an excuse to stop playing nice with France, this was it. Sure, inheritance disputes made for dramatic declarations, but deeper forces were pushing the two kingdoms toward war. For starters, money. Always money. England depended heavily on exporting wool to the clothmakers of Flanders, modern-day Belgium, who just happened to be rebellious subjects of the French king. Controlling that trade, or at least protecting it, gave England strong reason to meddle in continental politics. Then there were the pirates. Yep, pirates. The Channel became a hot zone of unofficial raids and sanctioned piracy, with English and French ships attacking each other's merchants like it was some sort of bloody game of battleship. These constant naval skirmishes inflamed tensions further. It wasn't long before unofficial warfare turned into the real thing. Add to that the ever-present struggle over Scotland. The French had this charming habit of supporting Scottish rebellions against England, the Ode Alliance as it was called, while England saw this as France sticking its nose where it didn't belong. If you were looking for a 14th century version of proxy wars, this was it. France, we're just helping our Scottish friends. England, by helping them raid us. Classy. By 1337, yes, fittingly, the most elite year of medieval history, Edward III had had enough. He declared himself the rightful king of France and prepared to back that claim with steel. Philip VI, of course, disagreed. Thus, the scene was set for a war that would drag on through multiple generations, see the rise and fall of kings, and leave Europe forever changed. What began as a squabble over who should sit on the French throne would snowball into battles that shattered the idea of chivalry, bankrupted kingdoms, and ushered in the end of the medieval era, and all because nobody could just agree on who got Grandpa's chair. The 100 Years' War, proof that medieval politics was just one big game of musical thrones, and someone kept stealing the music. So, the English have officially declared that they deserve France's throne, and naturally, that means it's time to show up at the neighbour's house with a few thousand friends, burn the garden, steal the silverware, and claim you were invited. Enter the chevauchée, a term that sounds fancy, but really means riding around, setting things on fire, and looting everything that's not nailed down. Edward III and his commanders perfected this delightful medieval pastime. The English strategy early in the war was less about conquering territory and more about making life miserable for the French countryside, because nothing says, I'm your king now, like torching entire villages and stealing the local livestock. The chevauchées were brutal, but weirdly effective. The French knights would ride out, furious and ready to defend their honour, only to find that their fields were smoking ruins and the English had vanished over the next hill, laughing all the way to the wine cellar. The English weren't playing by the old chivalric rules. No grand challenges, no single combat between noble champions, just scorched earth and empty barns. It was psychological warfare with extra hay theft, and the French hated it. Of course, all that riding around looting villages wasn't enough. Eventually, someone had to fight a proper battle. That someone turned out to be the fleets of France and England in 1340 at the Battle of Sluys. Picture it, two giant masses of ships crammed into a narrow estuary, like a medieval traffic jam, with more arrows and fewer apologies. The English, with their superior seamanship, and let's be honest, a healthy dose of luck, managed to trap and annihilate the French navy. It wasn't just a victory, it was a naval massacre. France's ability to challenge England at sea was effectively sunk, literally, and now the English could ferry their armies across the Channel without worrying too much about pesky French ships getting in the way. With the seas cleared, Edward III set his sights on land battles, where his new favourite toy, the longbow, would come into its own. Now, if there were an award for the medieval weapon most likely to ruin a knight's day, the longbow would win, hands down. This 6-foot stick of death could fire arrows at terrifying speeds and distances, piercing armour, and making charging cavalry look like pincushions. The French, still clinging to their chivalric ideals, loved a good cavalry charge. The English, they loved watching those cavalry charges get torn to pieces by thousands of arrows. Nowhere was this mismatch more obvious than at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. The French army, vast and glittering with armoured knights, charged repeatedly at the smaller English force, confident in their nobility, and presumably their invincibility. The English response: stand behind a line of sharpened stakes, rain down arrow after arrow, and let the French do the hard work of falling over each other. The mud didn't help either. Horses slipped, knights fell, and the battlefield turned into something between a disaster scene and a very expensive pile-up. The English longbowmen didn't just win, they humiliated the French nobility. Chivalry, it turned out, didn't count for much when your opponent could shoot you from 200 yards away. And this wasn't just about individual battles, it was a whole new style of warfare. The English weren't interested in the old codes of knightly conduct, they were interested in winning. Their tactics were mobile, flexible, and brutally efficient. They combined their longbowmen with dismounted knights and men-at-arms, creating a kind of medieval combined arms force that could repel charges, defend positions, and tear apart larger armies piece by piece. The French, by contrast, kept trying the same tactics: noble charges, massed cavalry assaults, and kept getting the same result: defeat. What made it all the more galling for the French was that the English weren't even trying to take over huge swaths of land at this stage. They wanted to raid, pillage, humiliate, and ideally, force the French crown to the negotiating table. But as the victories stacked up, it started looking like maybe, just maybe, the English really could win more than just pride. Each chevauchée, each lopsided battle, chipped away at French morale and resources, leaving scars that would last for generations. If you were a French peasant, life during this phase of the war was a nightmare. Your fields burned, your crops stolen, and your lord either dead on the battlefield or too busy paying ransom to help you. If you were an English soldier, life was dangerous, but potentially lucrative. After all, those raids weren't just about military glory. They were about plunder, loot, and maybe a nice pile of gold goblets to show for your trouble. And if you were a French knight, well, let's just say you probably started dreading the sight of those English banners on the horizon. In short, the early phase of the 100 Years' War wasn't just about one king's claim over another. It was about the rise of a new way of fighting. One that didn't care much for tradition or honour, but cared a lot about winning, burning, and occasionally laughing all the way to the bank. Who needs enemy arrows when fleas do the job for free? Just when the English were getting really good at burning France and turning knights into pincushions, the universe decided to up the difficulty level for everyone. Enter the Black Death. If the 100 Years' War had been a grim game of chess between England and France, the plague was like someone flipping the board, setting the pieces on fire, and walking away. From 1347 onward, the war didn't so much stop as stagger along in a daze, while Europe tried to survive a biological catastrophe of epic proportions. Forget arrows and swords. Now the deadliest thing on the battlefield was a flea hitching a ride on a rat. The plague didn't care about national pride, royal claims, or who owned what chunk of Aquitaine. It swept through ports, cities, villages, and battle camps with horrifying speed. Soldiers packed together in unsanitary camps were especially vulnerable. Armies that had looked formidable on paper were reduced to shuffling bands of survivors, wondering what just happened. One day you're planning a raid, the next, half your unit is buried in a mass grave, and the survivors are wondering if that rash on their arm means their days are numbered. The disease moved faster than any army could. Ships carried it from the Black Sea to Italian ports, and from there it raced across France and England like wildfire. The war, once so energetic and brutal, slowed to a crawl as entire towns emptied out or sealed themselves off in desperation. Marching an army across France became less about avoiding enemy ambushes and more about avoiding infected villages and hoping your supply train wasn't spreading the plague faster than you could fight. For kings and commanders, the plague was a nightmare logistics problem. How do you feed an army when your peasants are dead? How do you pay your soldiers when the tax base has collapsed because everyone's too busy dying to plough fields or make goods? Both England and France found their military plans in ruins. Campaigns were delayed, cancelled, or disastrously undermanned. Sometimes, entire castles were left undefended because their garrisons had been wiped out by disease. It wasn't the enemy that forced truces and peace talks during these years. It was the simple fact that no one had enough healthy men to keep fighting. The social and economic wreckage was staggering. The plague killed anywhere from a third to half the population in many regions. That meant fewer peasants to work the land, fewer craftsmen to make armor or weapons, fewer merchants to sell goods. Prices for labor soared. For the first time in memory, the lower classes had bargaining power. Lords tried to impose wage controls, which naturally led to resentment, and soon enough, revolts. The social order that had underpinned the feudal system, the very system both England and France were fighting to control, was fracturing. When the survivors of the plague looked around, they saw a world where old hierarchies had been shaken, and nothing felt certain anymore. In England, these tensions would eventually boil over in revolts like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. But even in the plague years, the seeds were being sown. Meanwhile, in France, the plague added to the misery of towns already sacked by English raids. The peasants who survived often faced new taxes to pay for the war effort, because what better time to raise taxes than when half your population has just died? The result was anger, rebellion, and in some cases, outright anarchy. And don't forget the psychological toll. This wasn't just a disease that killed, it was a disease that terrified. Medieval people saw the plague as divine punishment, the end of days, or proof that the world had gone mad. Imagine being a soldier. You've survived the arrows at Crécy, dodged raiders on the road, only to watch your comrades drop dead from a disease no one understood. Morale plummeted. What was the point of fighting for a crown when God, or so many believed, seemed determined to punish everyone equally? The plague didn't just kill people, it killed momentum. For years, the 100 Years' War ground to a halt, or limped along in half-hearted campaigns that never achieved much. Skirmishes happened, sure, but the grand, decisive battles of the early war became rare. Even when armies did muster the strength to fight, they were often shadows of their former selves. The longbow didn't matter if no one was left to pull it. Cavalry charges lost their terror when the knights were too sick, or too few. Fleas in the end proved far more effective at levelling the playing field than any English archer or French knight. So as plague carts rattled down village streets, the war that had once been all-consuming became just one more misery in a continent, drowning in death. The kings still plotted, the nobles still schemed, but for a time, even their ambitions had to bow before the real master of the 14th century, the Black Death. If there's one thing that truly reshaped the 100 Years' War, and possibly gave French knights a lifelong fear of sticks with strings, it was the English longbow. Before the longbow became the star of the battlefield, warfare in Europe had a certain rhythm. Knights charged heroically and expensively into battle. Foot soldiers tried not to get trampled, and everyone hoped their side's cavalry would outshine the others. But once English archers showed up with their deceptively simple weapons, that chivalric dream of gleaming armor and gallant charges turned into a living nightmare. Let's break it down. The longbow was at first glance just a big piece of yew wood, roughly as tall as its user, strung with animal gut. No flashy decorations, no intricate engineering, just pure, deadly functionality. But in the hands of a trained English or Welsh archer, this humble weapon could shoot arrows at terrifying speed, and with enough force to punch through armor. A well-trained longbowman could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute. That meant before a charging knight could even close the distance, dozens of arrows might already be turning him into a very expensive pincushion. And here's the brutal kicker. These arrows weren't just pointy sticks. They were tipped with bodkin points designed to pierce chainmail and even plate armor at closer ranges. The knight, who had spent a fortune on his protective gear and probably spent a good chunk of his life being fitted for it, might find that all his preparation meant absolutely nothing when facing a rain of arrows falling faster than he could react. So much for the glory of the charge. Now it was all about trying to stay upright while your horse panicked, and you slowly resembled a porcupine. The longbow didn't just revolutionize killing, it changed battlefield tactics. The English became masters of setting up defensive positions where archers could do their worst. They'd stake out ground on a slope or behind marshy terrain, where heavy cavalry would struggle, plant sharpened stakes in front of their lines to stop horses, and let the archers go to work. When the French, still clinging to the idea that valor and shining armor would win the day, launched their cavalry charges, they walked straight into arrow storms that turned noblemen into corpses, faster than you could shout, "Vive la France!" Take the Battle of Crécy in 1346 as a prime example, without repeating earlier chapters' battle details. It was a longbow masterclass. French knights charged again and again, convinced that this time their bravery would carry the day. Each time, they were mowed down by relentless volleys, the air thick with whistling death. Horses screamed, men fell, and the ground became a churned mess of mud, blood, and broken dreams. Longbows had turned what should have been noble combat into slaughter at a distance. The psychological impact of the longbow was as significant as its physical damage. Imagine you're a knight, a symbol of the medieval elite, trained since boyhood to fight honorably, only to be felled by a peasant with a stick before you even got close enough to swing your sword. It upended the social order of battle. Suddenly, the humble archer mattered more than the high-born knight. This wasn't just about killing, it was about who had the power on the battlefield, and the longbow made sure that power shifted dramatically. And let's not forget the grisly side effects of this new form of warfare. A longbow arrow wound was no clean surgical cut. Those arrows could splinter bones, tear through organs, and leave jagged injuries that medieval medicine was utterly unprepared to treat. If the arrow didn't kill you outright, infection probably would. Removing an embedded arrow was agony, done with primitive tools and no pain relief. Unless, of course, you count biting on a piece of wood and screaming your lungs out as a form of anesthesia. Survivors often carried lasting injuries or disabilities, a grim souvenir of their encounter with English archery. Training to use the longbow was no small feat, either. English law required regular archery practice, and boys started young, developing the strength to draw bows with 100 to 150 pounds of pull weight. Archers' skeletons from this period often show asymmetry, their shoulders and arms literally reshaped by years of training. This wasn't a weapon you picked up on a whim, it was a lifetime commitment, one that could make a commoner into a kingmaker on the field of battle. All this created a stark contrast between English and French military thinking. The English embraced this practical, ruthless new way of waging war. The French, for much of the early war, clung to older notions of honor and prestige. The result? Battlefield after battlefield where French knights charged to their doom, while English archers stood firm, loosed their arrows, and quietly rewrote the rules of medieval warfare. So, next time you picture a grand medieval battle, remember, behind the knights in shining armor was a row of grim-faced archers, drawing back their bows, ready to prove once again that sometimes the simplest tools are the deadliest. If you ever imagined the 100 Years' War as a grand contest of noble knights, gleaming armor, and heroic deeds done for king, country, and damsels in distress, let me stop you right there. The truth, by the midpoint of this endless slog, chivalry was less about noble conduct and more about calculating how many gold coins you could squeeze out of the enemy's family. Forget the code of honor you read about in fairy tales. The battlefield had become a high-stakes game of capture, ransom, profit. At its core, medieval chivalry was supposed to mean something lofty: courage, loyalty, honor in battle, mercy toward the vanquished. Knights took oaths to uphold these ideals, and in theory, War was a place to prove one's valor while behaving with gentlemanly restraint. But let's be real, when you're in the middle of a ruinous generation-spanning conflict, like the 100 Years' War, the ideal of chivalry had about as much chance of surviving as a French knight charging into English longbow fire. Take the infamous Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where the illusion of chivalry really took a beating. There, the English, led by Edward the Black Prince, managed not only to smash a much larger French force, but also to capture King John II of France himself. Yes, an actual crowned king, scooped up like a prize turkey. And what did the English do with their royal catch? Did they release him out of the goodness of their hearts, as a chivalric code might suggest? Absolutely not. They carted him off to England, and demanded an eye-watering ransom so big it nearly bankrupted France. After years of negotiations and failed payments, the French coughed up millions of gold écus, a sum so massive it could have funded an army or rebuilt half the country, all for one man. And King John wasn't the only lucky soul to find himself a high-value hostage. The war saw a booming industry emerge around capturing wealthy or noble opponents. Capturing a knight, count, or even a well-dressed merchant could set you up for life. Soldiers, both high and low, started to see battles not as opportunities for glory, but as shopping trips for potential hostages. You could almost hear them thinking, nice armor, fancy horse, that guy's definitely worth a few thousand florins. What's more, this shift to ransom-driven warfare completely transformed battle behavior. Knights were now far more interested in capturing their opponents than killing them. After all, a dead enemy earned you nothing but a notch on your sword hilt. But a live, noble hostage could mean a mansion, land, or at least enough coin to drink like a lord for a year. This led to some truly bizarre battlefield moments, where fights might pause as soldiers tried to negotiate surrenders, or where knights would literally tackle each other off horses in hopes of taking a valuable prisoner alive. If medieval battles started as bloodbaths, they often ended in something resembling a chaotic auction house. Of course, this didn't mean the fighting was gentle. Before a knight could surrender and hope for ransom, he first had to survive the initial carnage, and for every wealthy noble who was captured and ransomed, hundreds of poor foot soldiers were simply slaughtered or left to rot on the field. Chivalry, it turned out, was a privilege reserved for those who could afford it. If you were a peasant with a spear, don't expect mercy. Your life wasn't worth negotiating over. The ransom economy warped the entire concept of war. Instead of focusing on strategic victories or defending territory, commanders increasingly worried about how much cash their conquests could bring in. Some knights even joined the war, not out of loyalty to king or cause, but purely as freelance adventurers looking to cash in. These so-called free companies of mercenaries roamed the countryside between battles, kidnapping nobles, extorting villages, and turning the war into an endless opportunity for profit. The line between soldier and bandit got blurrier with each passing year, and as ransoms became the main prize of war, the ideal of chivalry shriveled and died. The code that was supposed to guide knightly behavior had become a fig leaf covering up greed, debt, and self-interest. Debts, by the way, played a huge role in all this. Many knights were heavily in debt, thanks to the obscene costs of armor, horses, and maintaining their status, and a fat ransom was often the only way out of financial ruin. Suddenly, the noble pursuit of war was really just a desperate bid to pay off creditors and avoid losing the family estate. It's hard not to see the irony. Chivalry promised honor, protection of the weak, and noble sacrifice. But the 100 Years' War showed that when push came to shove, nothing said chivalry like beating up a fellow noble, hauling him off the field, and demanding his family hand over their fortune to get him back. The battlefield wasn't a place of heroic ideals. It was the medieval version of a get-rich-quick scheme, played out with swords and lances. And so, the myth of the knightly code lay buried beneath piles of ransom receipts and IOUs. By the time this chapter of the war closed, the only thing truly honored on the battlefield was gold. If you thought the 100 Years' War was a relentless blur of battles, sieges, and archery-induced misery, you'd be right, but only partly. You see, every so often both sides would decide that maybe, just maybe, they were tired of bankrupting themselves and burying half the male population. Enter the peace treaties, grand agreements with impressive seals, lofty language, and all the staying power of a paper umbrella in a thunderstorm. The most infamous of these was the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, a peace deal that promised to end the fighting, only to serve as the war's extended lunch break before it lunged right back into chaos. Let's set the scene. After decades of brutal defeats, humiliating losses, and the capture of their own king at Poitiers, the French were reeling. The English, meanwhile, were riding high on victory, longbow pride, and an ever-growing collection of French hostages. But even the most hardened warrior or gold-thirsty commander eventually needed a breather. The economies of both kingdoms were in tatters, the people were restless, and plague had thinned the ranks on both sides. A pause in the carnage seemed like common sense, or at least as much common sense as anyone could muster in a century-long feud. So in 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny was hammered out. The deal was simple, on paper anyway. England would give up its claim to the French throne, a claim that had been the original match to this bonfire, and in return, it would keep a hefty chunk of territory, pretty much all of Aquitaine, plus a few extra bits of real estate for good measure. France would pay a colossal ransom for King John II. Yes, the same king they lost at Poitiers, and both sides would call it quits. It was the kind of grand diplomatic gesture that made kings and nobles feel very pleased with themselves. But as any student of medieval diplomacy could tell you, the ink on these treaties was barely dry before someone found a loophole, broke a promise, or decided that peace was overrated. The Treaty of Bretigny was no different. Sure, the English got their land, but holding on to it proved harder than winning it in battle. French locals weren't exactly thrilled to be governed by foreigners who spoke with funny accents and taxed them into the ground. Rebellions flared, territories were contested, and before long, those supposedly ceded lands were battlegrounds once more. And then there were the ransoms. France struggled mightily to raise the money to buy back King John. They taxed peasants, squeezed merchants, and begged the church. They paid what they could, but the cost of the king's freedom was like an ever-growing debt. No matter how much they sent, it never seemed to be enough. To make matters worse, after being released, King John's sense of honor, or possibly his guilt, led him to voluntarily return to English captivity when his son failed to deliver the promised hostages as part of the deal. That's right, he handed himself back over, like a guest who forgot his hat at a party and came back for it, except the hat was his royal dignity. Meanwhile, the Peace of Bretigny didn't stop the armies of both sides from behaving like wolves at a sheep convention. English and French mercenaries, now unemployed thanks to the supposed truce, formed free companies, roving bands of armed thugs who terrorized the countryside, extorted towns, and kept the bloodshed alive. In many ways, these freebooters were worse than the war itself, because at least during official battles there were rules, or at least pretend rules. These guys were just in it for profit, leaving a trail of destruction from the Loire Valley to the Pyrenees. As the years ticked by, the fragile peace crumbled completely. Neither side could resist poking at the wounds left by the treaty. Arguments flared over borders, taxes, and what exactly had been promised to whom. Alliances shifted like sand underfoot, and before long the war lurched back to life, as inevitable as a bad sequel. By 1369, less than a decade after Bretigny, hostilities had resumed in full, with both sides apparently deciding that fighting was easier than negotiating with people who broke their word at the drop of a helmet. And the Treaty of Bretigny wasn't alone in its failure. Throughout the 100 Years' War, treaty after treaty was drawn up with grand declarations of peace and brotherhood, only to dissolve into fresh rounds of warfare as soon as one side saw an advantage. The Treaty of Troyes, decades later, was another spectacular example. It tried to settle the succession question by disinheriting the French Dauphin, the future Charles VII, and naming the English king's heirs as rulers of France. Did it work? Only long enough for people to draw up the paperwork. Once Henry V of England died, the whole plan unraveled faster than a poorly stitched surcoat. Ultimately, peace treaties in the 100 Years' War were less about achieving peace, and more about buying time, pauses for breath, rearming, and figuring out the next move on a very bloody chessboard. The war had taken on a life of its own, sustained by pride, greed, the simple fact that no one wanted to be the first to blink. So much for chivalry, so much for diplomacy. The 100 Years' War kept grinding on, with every treaty a temporary bandage slapped onto a gaping wound that refused to heal. The only thing more predictable than a treaty being signed was it being broken, By the late 14th century, France had had enough of being England's punching bag. After decades of humiliation on the battlefield, the catastrophic capture of their king, and a peace treaty that wasn't worth the parchment it was written on, the French finally decided that maybe, just maybe, the solution wasn't to keep charging headfirst into English arrows. Instead, they tried a radical new approach: better leadership, smarter tactics, and commanders who weren't just noble-born, but actually competent. Revolutionary, right? Enter Charles V, a man who probably kept a list titled "Things Not to Do Because My Father Did Them." Charles V, known as Charles the Wise, and not just because the bar was set low by previous kings, ascended to the throne with one clear goal: stop the bleeding. The days of flashy charges and doomed chivalric glory were over. Charles understood that the English, with their longbows, mobile forces, and ruthless chevauchés, weren't going to be beaten by honor alone. France needed strategy, not pageantry. And of course, it needed a commander who could turn these ideas into victories. This is where Bertrand du Guesclin enters our stage, a Breton knight who looked less like a chivalric poster boy and more like the guy you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley. He wasn't your typical medieval commander. No, du Guesclin was scrappy, practical, and absolutely not interested in dying a glorious death for the sake of a poem. His philosophy was simple: make life as miserable as possible for the enemy, while staying alive to enjoy it. A true innovator. Under Charles V and du Guesclin, France abandoned the let's charge and hope for the best approach. Instead, they adopted tactics that seemed designed to give English commanders migraines: hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, harassment of supply lines. These were the new tools of French resistance. Fortified towns became traps for unwary English garrisons. Guerrilla-style warfare, though no one called it that yet, turned the tables. The French learned that they didn't need to win massive set-piece battles. They just had to make holding territory so costly and unpleasant that the English would eventually give it up as a bad investment. Gone were the grand doomed fields like Crécy or Poitiers, where French knights lined up in neat rows for English archers to mow down. Now the French avoided those open battles whenever possible. They focused on sieges, small-scale skirmishes, and exhausting their enemies through constant pressure. Du Guesclin, in particular, excelled at using France's geography, its forests, rivers, and castle-dotted hills, as natural allies. The English weren't just fighting men, they were fighting the very land itself, and it was not a friendly landscape. Meanwhile, Charles V waged a quieter, but no less important, war of paperwork and gold. He reformed taxation to the delight of no one, but the treasury needed filling, strengthened royal authority, and rebuilt France's fractured administration. Under his rule, the kingdom gradually clawed its way back from near ruin. French fortifications were rebuilt or improved, and regions that had been lawless after the English invasions were brought back under control. Bit by bit, France stopped bleeding and started healing. The English, on the other hand, began to feel the weight of their own overreach. Their early successes had given them vast territories, but holding and governing those lands was a logistical nightmare. Garrisons cost money, supply chains stretched thin. Local populations, once cowed, now saw the French resurgence and grew bolder in their resistance. What had once been easy pickings turned into a quagmire of constant skirmishes and uprisings. English commanders found themselves bogged down, forced to defend more and more with fewer and fewer resources. Add to this the growing unrest back home in England, political instability, economic troubles, and the occasional outbreak of plague, and the once mighty English war machine started to sputter. The English advantage, built on technological superiority and battlefield dominance, eroded as the French adapted. The longbow was still deadly, but it couldn't win wars alone. And with Charles V wisely avoiding big battles, the longbowmen were left standing around, wondering where their next heroic slaughter might come from. By the end of Charles V's reign, France had regained large portions of the land lost during the disastrous early decades of the war. The English were on the back foot, struggling to hold what they had once seized with such ease. It was a reversal that no one in the heady days of Crécy or Poitiers could have predicted. In short, the French had learned, painfully, bloodily, and over many years, but they had learned. The age of the heroic knight charging into glory had given way to the age of the clever commander, outthinking his foes. By the early 15th century, France's long miserable slog of a war seemed to be winding down in the worst way possible, with the English winning. The French crown was a mess, the morale of the people had sunk somewhere beneath the Loire River, and the English and their allies held vast swaths of French land. The Dauphin, Charles V, who at this point could have been voted least likely to succeed by his own nobles, seemed powerless to change the tide. Enter Joan of Arc, a teenage girl from a small village, who would, through sheer force of will and some help from divine visions, shock the world and do what seasoned generals and kings had failed at for decades. Joan was born around 1412 in Domremy, a little nowhere in northeastern France where the cows probably outnumbered the people. By all accounts, she was an ordinary peasant girl until she began hearing voices, and not just any voices. These were the big names: Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret. Imagine being a farmer's daughter, tending sheep one day, and the next day the literal Archangel Michael is telling you to go kick the English out of France. Talk about pressure. But Joan wasn't one to ignore a holy calling. At age 17, she somehow managed what no one else could. She got an audience with the Dauphin. This wasn't easy. The French court was packed with cynical nobles, scheming bureaucrats, and commanders who'd seen far too much failure to believe a teenager could save the realm. But Joan's absolute conviction, her charisma, and frankly the sheer strangeness of the situation cut through their doubts. Here was this peasant girl in men's armor, scandalous, claiming that God himself had sent her to deliver France, and somehow Charles and his advisors decided, well, it's not like our current plan is working, let's give her a shot. Joan's first major test came at Orléans, a city under siege and on the brink of falling to the English. This wasn't just any city. If Orléans fell, the road to conquering what remained of France would be wide open. The French forces inside the city were demoralized, leaderless, and probably wondering if God had abandoned them entirely. And then Joan rode in. Picture it, a teenage girl in gleaming armor, carrying a banner instead of a sword, rallying hardened men who'd lost all hope. And somehow, against all odds, it worked. Joan inspired the French forces to launch daring attacks against the English siege lines. Her presence turned the tide, not because she had a secret battle plan, but because she made people believe again. The French broke the siege in 1429, and suddenly it felt like maybe, just maybe, this war wasn't lost after all. To the English, Joan must have seemed like a walking nightmare, a divine force they couldn't outfight, outshoot, or outscheme. To the French, she was a living miracle. But Joan wasn't done. After Orléans, she pushed Charles VII to go to Reims for his coronation, because what good is a king if he isn't properly crowned in the traditional city? The journey was dangerous, the territory uncertain, but Joan led the way. And sure enough, Charles was crowned, in no small part thanks to the girl who had become the beating heart of French resistance. Yet, as with so many bright flames, Joan's story took a dark turn. Politics, as always, reared its ugly head. Joan's success unsettled plenty of powerful people. French nobles who didn't like being shown up by a teenage peasant, English commanders desperate to stop her, and Burgundian allies of the English, eager to score points. In 1430, Joan was captured during a skirmish at Compiègne by Burgundian forces. Instead of ransoming her, as was common practice, they handed her over to the English, because nothing says thanks for saving the nation like selling out your greatest hero. Joan's trial was as much a show trial as any in history, accused of heresy, witchcraft, and dressing like a man. Yes, that was an actual charge. Medieval priorities. Everyone. Joan faced a panel of clerics, determined to silence her. Despite her youth, she handled herself with astonishing courage and wit, often outsmarting her interrogators. But the verdict was a foregone conclusion. In 1431, at just 19 years old, Joan was burned at the stake in Rouen. A martyr was born. Her death was supposed to break French morale. Instead, it made her legend unstoppable. Joan of Arc became not just a hero of France, but a symbol of resistance, faith, and the power of one determined soul against overwhelming odds. Her example would continue to inspire long after the war itself sputtered to a close. If the 100 Years' War were a play, this chapter would be the long, awkward final act, where the hero forgets his lines, the villain leaves the stage early, and the props fall apart. By the time the war dragged into its last decades, England had transformed from the confident, longbow-wielding terror of France into a nation that couldn't afford to keep the show going, or even pay for new costumes. What started as a bold campaign to claim the French throne fizzled into a slow, painful retreat, marked by poor leadership, empty coffers, and a kingdom distracted by its own internal disasters. Let's start with the royal mess that was England's leadership at this point. Henry V, the charismatic king who once made France tremble at Agincourt, had died young in 1422. His infant son Henry VI was declared king of both England and France. At least on paper, the reality, Henry VI would grow up to be one of the most ineffective and mentally fragile monarchs in English history. His reign was marked by bouts of catatonia, indecision, and a complete inability to manage his nobles, let alone a trans-channel empire. While the French were rallying behind the memory of Joan of Arc and leaders like Charles VII, England was stuck with a king who made Hamlet look like a decisive man of action. It didn't help that England was flat broke. War, it turns out, is expensive. All those arrows, armor, ships, and mercenaries had to be paid for somehow. In the early years, loot from raids and ransoms kept the treasury afloat, but by the 1440s, that well had run dry. The victories were fewer, the plunder was scarcer, and the cost of holding on to scattered French territories outweighed any benefits. England's war chest, once filled by taxes and spoils, was reduced to a collection of IOUs, pawned crown jewels, and increasingly desperate pleas to Parliament for funds. Unfortunately, Parliament was also getting tired of writing blank cheques for a war that no longer seemed winnable. And while France was slowly clawing back its lost lands, England was busy tearing itself apart from the inside. Enter the War of the Roses, the dynastic struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York for the English throne. Picture a nation already stretched thin, trying to hold on to foreign conquests, suddenly imploding in civil war. The nobles, who once led armies across the Channel, were now more interested in fighting each other for power at home. The crown's authority weakened, the military focus splintered, and the funds that should have gone to defending Normandy or Calais were instead spent hiring troops to fight in English fields. It was like trying to fix your neighbour's roof while your own house was burning down. France, meanwhile, seized the moment. Charles VII, the once wobbly Dauphin, who'd become a shrewd and effective king, reorganized the French army, introduced permanent standing forces, and modernized tactics. The days of English longbow supremacy were over. Now it was the French who had the upper hand, both in strategy and technology. Hello early artillery. Piece by piece, English territories in France fell, Normandy was retaken, Gascony was lost. Towns that had been English for generations returned to French hands, often welcomed by locals eager to see the back of their foreign overlords. By the 1450s, English rule in France was reduced to little more than Calais, a lonely outpost clinging to the edge of the continent, more symbol than prize. And even that would eventually fall, though it would hang on for another century or so. The grand vision of an English king ruling over both England and France lay in ruins, buried under decades of bad decisions, empty treasuries, and domestic squabbling. The war, which had once been about glory, honour, and dynastic claims, ended not with a triumphant victory or a dramatic final battle, but with England quietly slinking back across the Channel, licking its wounds. As the curtain fell on this centuries-long debacle, all that remained were the lessons that ambition without means leads to ruin, that leadership matters more than lineage, and that no one, not even kings, can afford a war forever. When the dust finally settled on the 100 Years' War, if, after 116 years of on-again, off-again mayhem, dust could ever truly settle, Europe looked a lot different than when the first arrow flew at Sluys or Cressy. This wasn't just a long spat between royal cousins who couldn't agree on who got to wear the fancier crown. It was a conflict that reshaped nations, ruined countless lives, and hammered the final nails into the coffin of the medieval world as people knew it. Let's talk about that human cost first. Imagine generations who knew nothing but the looming spectre of war, entire villages burned down and rebuilt, only to be torched again by the next passing army. Farmers became soldiers out of desperation. Soldiers became bandits when their pay ran out. Fields that once fed kingdoms were trampled under cavalry charges, or left to grow wild because no one dared farm them. It's estimated that hundreds of thousands died from battle, famine, plague, or just the general chaos of living in a war zone for over a century. And let's not forget the displaced peasants driven from their homes, townsfolk who fled from siege to siege, entire families scattered like seeds in the wind. By the end, disillusionment wasn't just a mood, it was the air people breathed. And what about the winners? Well, technically France came out on top. They kept their kingdom intact, except Calais, and booted out the English. But winner is a strong word when your countryside looks like someone used it for jousting practice. France was battered, yes, but also hardened. The endless struggle forced the French crown to centralize power and build a stronger, more organized monarchy. Charles Savempsa's reforms set the stage for kings like Louis XI, who would continue reigning in the nobility and forging a more modern state. France emerged bloodied, but on the road to becoming a true nation. England, meanwhile, limped home with its pride wounded and its coffers empty. The war had drained the treasury, exposed the weaknesses of its monarchy, and sown the seeds of civil strife. In fact, it didn't take long for the War of the Roses to kick off, as if England looked at its ruinous continental adventure and thought, you know what we need? More war, but at home this time. And yet, the 100 Years' War had long-term effects on England too. It helped forge a sense of national identity, even if that identity involved grumbling about losing France, and it highlighted the need for better governance, lessons that would take centuries and a few more revolutions to fully sink in. But perhaps the most profound legacy of this epic saga was the death of the old chivalric world. The age of the knight in shining armor, galloping off to noble duels under the code of chivalry, was on life support by the war's end. Longbows had humbled the heavily armored elite. Cannons had blown holes in once impregnable castle walls. Professional standing armies began to replace feudal levies. The battlefield was no longer a stage for personal glory, but a brutal, noisy, and chaotic place, where technology and tactics mattered more than birthright or honor. The 100 Years' War didn't just redraw maps, it rewrote the rules of warfare. And so, after more than a century of fighting, burning, looting, scheming, and occasional peace treatying, what did everyone learn? Castles, for all their grandeur, couldn't stand up to gunpowder. Cousins with crowns tend to make terrible neighbors, and if you're going to claim a throne, maybe have a solid plan for how to keep it. Europe would never be the same, and the medieval world was fading fast, leaving behind lessons carved in stone, scarred into fields, and whispered in the legends of long-dead kings and queens. So ends the saga of the 100 Years' War. But history, as always, was just getting started. Who's ready for the next mess?